Connection opens with a chaotic atmosphere of chases in various places. Currently, the South Korean government is trying to eradicate illegal drugs, which is increasingly disturbing. As captain, Detective Jung mobilizes his squad to chase down all the notorious drug cartels. Starting from subordinates to high-ranking drug gangs, they are arrested one by one. Everyone except the gang leader, Ojiomipa, is arrested. One night, Detective Jung received information about the gang leader's whereabouts at a restaurant. Detective Jung and his juniors set up a plan. They entered the restaurant disguised as customers and observed the gang leader talking to someone. However, a woman named Yoonjin, who Detective Jung recognizes, came to meet another man. Yoonjin is a reporter. Detective Jung overhears the conversation taking place. Yoonjin is investigating a case about an older adult who hasn't received his salary. The man in front of her asked Yoonjin to withdraw the case article on the grounds that he had reconciled with older people. Yoonjin refused, but because she received the envelope, Yoonjin finally agreed. However, the envelope did not contain money, but rather a letter of agreement between the employee and the employer regarding arrears. Yoonjin also realized that someone else was secretly recording their meeting. Yoonjin knew she was being framed. She forced the man in front of her to take out his cell phone, and the man resisted. He then showed evidence that Yoonjin had been doing the dirty work all this time. The man asked Yoonjin not to disturb his company anymore because he had recorded all their conversations. Yoonjin was silent. The man and his friends then left. Detective Jung was silent, but then he realized that the gang leader was watching him with a suspicious expression. Detective Jung panicked. The gang leader immediately ran away, and obviously, Detective Jung and his juniors gave chase. The gang leader's escape created chaos, but other police came to stop him. The gang leader immediately entered a building and threatened a woman. Detective Jung bravely aims the gun, deliberately shooting in another direction, but the gang leader still runs away until his escape is stopped on the rooftop. In close-range hand-to-hand combat, Detective Jung dominates. The gang leader could no longer fight. He gave up and asked to be arrested. He didn't want to be beaten again. But Detective Jung remembers that the gang leader once injured his favorite junior's leg tendon. The gang leader had no regrets at all. The other juniors who arrived at the rooftop panicked when they saw the gang leader in pain because Detective Jung had shot his leg. A month later, Detective Jung is questioned regarding the misuse of a gun while trying to arrest the gang leader. At that time, the only people on the rooftop were Detective Jung and the gang leader. A male junior only heard the sound of gunshots and finally found the gang leader injured by being shot directly in the leg tendon. A month before the gang leader was arrested, Detective Jung's favorite junior was also injured in the same area. The officers believed that Detective Jung was seeking revenge, but Detective Jung calmly and without guilt said that he was only following protocol in self-defense, even though Detective Jung actually intended to take revenge on the gang leader. Finally, Detective Jung was declared not guilty. The successful arrest of the gang leader earned Detective Jung a promotion. Everyone is happy and congratulates him. Detective Jung's favorite junior also arrives in a wheelchair and is proud of his promotion. After that, they took a photo together. Detective Jung was then taken home by one of his juniors. Detective Jung deliberately left an envelope of money and asked his junior to give it to his favorite junior. When he returned home, Detective Jung talked about his happiness at being promoted to a photo of his mother. In the evening, Detective Jung was visited by his old friend Park Junio. 20 years ago, Park was class president and attended the same school as Detective Jung. Park's arrival wanted to congratulate him on his promotion and also wanted to apologize before it was too late. Detective Jung needs clarification about whether the apology has anything to do with the case from 20 years ago. If true, Detective Jung will not forgive him. Detective Jung also doesn't understand why they haven't spoken to each other for 20 years, but Park suddenly comes only to regret what happened 20 years ago. Park admits that he regrets that he didn't listen to Detective Jung in the past. He felt stupid and cowardly. Detective Jung also confirmed that during his time as a police officer, he had met many people like Park who were stupid, cowardly, and greedy, but they were punished. Meanwhile, Park can still live happily with his other friends. Detective Jung still doesn't want to forgive Park and drives him away. Park said goodbye. Detective Jung remembers an incident 20 years ago when he was still in high school. Detective Jung made a report to the police about an incident. He stated that Park saw what happened, but Park denied it and said Detective Jung was lying. After that, Detective Jung gets angry with Park because they were good friends, but Park betrayed him. At the office a month ago, due to a conflict with a man from the company, Yoonjin's boss became very angry. But now, Yoonjin is allowed to return to work as usual. Yoonjin was clearly happy. She immediately wanted to go to work while calling her friend. At the same time, a woman looked anxious when she saw the motorbike courier coming to the apartment, coincidentally with her child who had just been taken by car to school. The woman collided with Yoonjin until Yoonjin's cell phone was broken and would turn on. When Yoonjun wanted to get angry and demand responsibility from the woman, she instead opened the package she had just received. It turned out that the package contained a yellow pill, which the woman immediately consumed. Yoonjun was confused. The woman became calmer, but the woman's daughter had noticed her mother's strange behavior. The woman realized her bad actions. She wanted to leave, but instead was hit by a car and died. After that, Yoonjun was questioned by the police, and she gave her account of what happened. As a reporter, Yoonjun asked the police about what she saw. The police, who didn't know much about the yellow pill, made Yoonjun believe that the pill was a new type of illegal drug. The police then confiscated the dead woman's yellow pills. After that, Yoonjun returned to the office and explained what happened. Yoonjun felt that she was destined to be a reporter because she had just witnessed an incident of a woman who was addicted to illegal drugs. That evening, Detective Jung and his team eat together to celebrate his promotion. Meanwhile, at the same time, Park enters a deserted construction site. After eating together, Detective Jung was too drunk, and they were going to go home. Detective Jung also hopes that his favorite junior will recover quickly from his wounds. Then Detective Jung goes to the toilet. He received a message from someone claiming to be a doctor and told him a location and clothes with the code 1882. Detective Jung remembered that before Park left his house, Park brought up their emergency code 1882. Detective Jung tries to call the number, but it's not active. Park's cell phone number is also inactive. Detective Jung tries to ignore him, but when he is in the toilet, he is immediately ambushed with black plastic. An unknown person kidnaps Detective Jung. There were various strange blurry visions until finally, Detective Jung regained consciousness. This man was woken up by his junior at the train station. Detective Jung is confused, his head is still dizzy. The junior was worried and wanted to know why Detective Jung couldn't be contacted for the past 3 days. Detective Jung also remembers the kidnapping incident. The young man also showed the message that Detective Jung sent to come to the station. Detective Jung needs to remember to send that message. As Detective Jung still staggers, a train arrives. Detective Jung walks onto the train and sees a suspicious woman. Then the train stopped again at the next station, and the woman Detective Jung suspected was secretly exchanging the items she was carrying with a man wearing a hat. Detective Jung immediately chased the man in the hat, but the man realized he was being followed and immediately ran fast. Until finally the mysterious man fell and the items he was carrying fell. Detective Jung continues to chase him despite the unfavorable circumstances. Detective Jung looks for a quick way to catch the man in the hat until finally the man in the hat enters the yard of a female resident. The man in the hat has a scar on his face. He tries to fight back with a knife, making Detective Jung brandish the gun. A close fight ensued, but the gun was taken. Detective Jung loses energy and ends up unconscious. Long story short, Detective Jung finally wakes up, and the older woman explains that the mysterious man has gone to get his gun. Previously, Detective Jung had thrown away the bullets in the gun, but now only 3 bullets were found. Detective Jung asked the woman not to say anything about what happened. Detective Jung went and contacted his junior, who managed to catch the woman on the train. It turned out that the woman was a part-time courier who got a job delivering illegal drugs. The police have also confiscated the medicine that fell. Detective Jung will be at the office soon. He stopped at the mini-market and bought a drink. However, when he wanted to pay, Detective Jung realized there was a yellow pill in his jacket pocket. Detective Jung is confused. On the way to the office by taxi, Detective Jung doesn't know why the illegal drugs are on him. Detective Jung then gets a message from the doctor containing a video. Apparently, during the 3 days he was kidnapped, Detective Jung was deliberately forced to take yellow pills by someone who is still unknown. The doctor sent a message asking Detective Jung to take his medicine regularly. Detective Jung is getting dizzy. Then he pulled over and vomited on the side of the road. Elsewhere, a construction worker was shocked to find a body. Yoonjun asked the security guard at her apartment and wanted to know the identity of the woman who previously died because she was hit by a car. Then Yoonjun received news of someone's death. Detective Jung is now at the police station, panicking about his missing gun and starting to feel the effects of the drug. Detective Jung feels that what made him who he is today was the leader of the Ojiomipa gang. Detective Jung is really annoyed. Meanwhile, the woman who was the courier on the train is now in the interrogation room. His junior shows him the message that Detective Jung previously sent him. There was someone called a doctor, and the number 1882 they didn't understand. Then Detective Jung approached the investigative team because he wanted to know the current developments in the case. They were waiting for a sketch of the face of the man they were looking for. One of Detective Jung's colleagues wants to know the meaning of the doctor in 1882 and the message Detective Jung sent to the junior, but Detective Jung doesn't know either. Detective Jung asks his junior to trace someone's number and wants to go to the hospital, where the leader of the Ojiomipa gang is being treated. Meanwhile, other police investigate the case of a person's death at a construction site. Surprisingly, the investigation was immediately taken over by the prosecutor. They will hand over the victim's belongings to the prosecutor's office, but apparently the victim's cell phone was not given a passcode at all. They meet Detective Jung, and the police inspector congratulates him because Detective Jung has been promoted, and now their positions are equal. Detective Jung tries to ignore it and dials Park's number, but it connects to the cell phone the other cop is carrying. Detective Jung is annoyed and wants to know Park's whereabouts. The police were confused because Detective Jung had a relationship with a man who had just died. After receiving information that Park died in the construction area, Detective Jung continues his journey, but he can no longer walk. His body weakened and he immediately got into the taxi, which had just dropped off the passengers. He asked to be taken to the hospital. Detective Jung is unconscious and his blood is drawn. Detective Jung wakes up in the hospital and panics. He knows that no one can check his blood, and no one can know if there are illegal drugs in his blood. Detective Jung wants to get his blood back. With heavy, half-staggering steps, Detective Jung tried to follow the nurse until he forced his way into the officer's room and locked himself inside. Detective Jung immediately looked for his blood and consumed it. Detective Jung is getting dizzy. He wanted to take the only yellow pill in his pocket, but he was a police officer and had to investigate the chaos that had occurred. Finally, he crushed the yellow pill. The people outside panicked and asked Detective Jung to open the door. Then the door opened and Detective Jung immediately ran away. In 2005, Detective Jung received a message from Park with the code 1882. Detective Jung panicked and immediately ran to Park, but Park admitted that he was only joking. Detective Jung was annoyed and warned him not to use code 1882 carelessly. After that, they went home together. Park, who always listens to music, makes Detective Jung feel strange. Detective Jung doesn't like music because he finds it ridiculous. Park then said that they would have a new student tomorrow. They then froze, seeing the woman at the bus stop listening to music. When the bus arrived, the woman was gone. 20 years ago, Detective Jung was confronted by adults and several other students, one of whom was Park. Detective Jung has just made a report to the police station stating that Park saw what happened, but Park says that Detective Jung is lying. Park said he didn't see anything. Everyone in the room increasingly corners Detective Jung. Back to the present, the recording of Detective Jung entering the special room for hospital officers and causing a commotion is finally investigated by his junior. The security guards and hospital nurses protest to Junior Detective Jung. Even though Detective Jung is a police officer, he shouldn't cause trouble in the hospital. The nurse was also injured. The junior police apologized and will investigate further. The hospital doctor believes that Detective Jung is addicted to illegal drugs, but Detective Jung comes forward to refute the doctor's accusations. Detective Jung only took his blood again because he didn't agree to the blood draw. Detective Jung says that he's from the Narcotics Crime Division, so he can't have an addiction. The reason Detective Jung made a scene was because he didn't agree to have his blood taken without permission. Detective Jung is very angry because he is not feeling well. Detective Jung also apologizes to the injured nurse and then leaves. In the elevator, the junior checked on Detective Jung's condition. The junior, Kim Chang-soo, is confused by Detective Jung's behavior, which was recorded on CCTV. Detective Jung admitted that he was just angry because his blood was taken without permission. Kim Chang-soo can't understand the mess that Detective Jung made. It's a good thing everything went smoothly, or Detective Jung would have been in big trouble. Detective Jung's arrival at the hospital did not seem to be due to illness. The junior knows that Detective Jung will meet the leader of the Ojiomipa gang and will keep his mouth shut to his other police colleagues. Junior then went home first. Meanwhile, Detective Jung took a pair of scissors and asked the policeman on duty to guard the gang leader's room to rest. Detective Jung goes into the man's room, asks about Yoonjin, and shows him a photo of a yellow pill. Detective Jung believes the gang leader is now trying to get revenge, but the gang leader doesn't know what Detective Jung is talking about. The gang leader also wants revenge on Detective Jung, but he can't do anything. Detective Jung wants to know why the gang leader killed Park Junio, but the gang leader doesn't know who Park Junio is. The man was actually confused as to why Detective Jung came to him just wanting to talk about a man. Detective Jung becomes angry with this man. He started cutting the bandage on his injured leg. The gang leader panicked and called for help. Detective Jung starts beating him up and threatens to maim the gang leader. Detective Jung asks the gang leader to answer honestly. The gang leader still claims he doesn't know anything about Park Junio. He even wet his bed because he was so scared. The man only explained that he only knew about the yellow pills distributed by someone named Boss Yun, but did not know who produced the medicine. Boss Yun only circulated, and the gang leader didn't know her whereabouts. The leader of the Ojiomipa gang doesn't know Boss Yun's face because his business is run via the internet. Boss Yun can also change her name at will. The gang leader also didn't know about Park Junio. He doesn't have any problems with Park Junio. In fact, if he wanted to kill, Detective Jung would be the one the man would kill first. Earlier, Detective Jung's cruelty was apparently observed by the junior who didn't come home. Another time, a man with a wound on his face has been holding Detective Jung's gun. Previously, after winning against Detective Jung, he took 2 bullets. The mysterious man's younger brother asked them to stay away for fear of the doctor being discovered by the police, then dragged Boss Yun into this matter. But the mysterious man still went to meet the woman called Boss Yun. So this man was the middleman between the doctor and Boss Yun. For the time being, drug production will be limited, but Boss Yun can still make transactions with doctors. After their business was finished, the man and his younger brother left. Boss Yun's subordinates are confused as to why the doctor seems to be trying to protect Detective Jung. So previously, it was the doctor who ordered Boss Yun to kidnap and force-feed Detective Jung with yellow pills. Meanwhile, Detective Jung is now walking the streets and checking CCTV all the way to the station. Detective Jung asks for CCTV footage and sees himself when he was kidnapped previously. Detective Jung, who was unconscious, was carried by 2 people whose faces were unclear and placed in front of platform 34. Detective Jung then asked for the data to be sent to his email. Detective Jung begins to guess there is a special reason why he was put there. Did the person who knocked him unconscious tell him to get on a train and catch a suspicious man in a hat? Is Detective Jung actually being used? Detective Jung doesn't know that the person who kidnapped and gave him the drug is the same. Later, Detective Jung comes to the Criminal Division office to find out more about Park's death. Park's body was found on Monday. His death is thought to have occurred on Friday midnight around 11:30 by jumping from the 9th floor. There are no autopsy results yet, and the prosecutor in charge is Tajin, Deputy Chief Prosecutor of Detective Division 1. Meanwhile, the police inspector outside is now contacted by Tajin and told that Detective Jung is investigating Park's death. The inspector knows that Detective Jung and Park used to be at the same school. Then the inspector was ordered to ask Detective Jung to leave immediately and not allow him to investigate anything because Park's death was their responsibility. Detective Jung then wants to leave, but he takes Park's cell phone and heads to the toilet. 2 policemen try to seize it, but Detective Jung examines the cell phone and checks who Park called before his death. After that, Detective Jung handed over the cell phone again and left. The 2 cops were very angry and irritated, but Detective Jung didn't care. Detective Jung goes to his office and gets a message from the doctor to take medicine. Detective Jung immediately asks his junior to trace the doctor's number now while the number is active. Detective Jung immediately responded to the doctor's message and wanted to know who the doctor was and why he knew about Code 1882 even though the code was only known by him and Park. Detective Jung also wants to know what Park's connection to the illegal drug yellow pill is, but the doctor said that Detective Jung would find out later and told Detective Jung to come to Park's funeral now. Junior police informed that the number had changed location. Detective Jung remembers that the caller's original location seemed to be a hospital. Detective Jung immediately went to the hospital, but the officer said that Park's body had been handed over to the family an hour ago without an autopsy. The prosecutor on duty has obtained approval from the family to carry out the funeral without an autopsy immediately. Detective Jung remembers that the prosecutor is Tajin. At the same time, Yoonjin was at an ATM near the funeral home and wanted to transfer money to her son. Detective Jung comes to Yoonjin. Detective Jung remembers that Yoonjin was one of the people Park contacted before he died. Yoonjin also remembered that she didn't answer Park's call, but then Park appeared in front of her. Now Yoonjin admits that she didn't pick up the phone from Park and explains that she forgot to call back. Detective Jung was suspicious because Park, who had never contacted him, suddenly called this woman, but Yoonjin forgot. That was very strange. But Yoonjin thought it was normal. Even Detective Jung can cut ties with his other friends. Yoonjin was even annoyed because Detective Jung seemed to be interrogating her. Detective Jung finally goes to where Park's body is. Yoonjin, who saw Detective Jung in a hurry, followed him. Detective Jung's arrival wanted to stop the embalming in progress, but a man named Jung Yoonho prevented it. Detective Jung comes in anyway, and Yoonjin explains that Detective Jung was their classmate 20 years ago. Detective Jung also examined Park's face, which was completely lifeless. Detective Jung also requested that the embalming be postponed. He will submit an autopsy and ask Park's wife to permit the autopsy. Jung Yoonho was immediately annoyed because Detective Jung acted as he pleased. Detective Jung explains Park's death as strange because Park ended his life and left his shoes on the floor of the building. 3 people suddenly entered the room and stopped Detective Jung's conversation. These 3 people are Tajin, who handles Park's case, one Jong-soo, the group leader, and Chai Hyun, one subordinate. Then they greet Detective Jung. They haven't seen each other for a long time. Detective Jung also remembers that one, Taejin, and Chai Hyun were the people Park contacted before he died. Of course, Detective Jung felt even more strange here. Detective Jung begins to ask why Taejin is handling Park's death case directly even though Taejin is the deputy chief prosecutor. Detective Jung also needs clarification about why Taejin concluded that Park died because he ended his life. Here Jung Yoon-ho is the angriest person. He defended Taejin. Detective Jung so explains that there are footprints on the stairs leading to the 9th floor at the construction site and the shoe prints are different from Park's shoes. Detective Jung feels that Taejin concluded the death without further investigation. However, Taejin said that Park had a reason to die because he suffered the loss of his 6-year-old child. Taejin also felt that Detective Jung was overreacting because he didn't know how Park was doing all this time. He asked Detective Jung not to add to the suffering of Park, who is already dead. But Detective Jung gets even angrier because Park didn't mention the reason for his death. Detective Jung wants to know what Park sent to the 3 people because they called them before he died. Detective Jung believes Park said something before he died. Jung Yoon-ho got angry and stopped Detective Jung from talking. Jung insisted that there was nothing strange about Park contacting his close friends. Jung doesn't accept it because Detective Jung used to betray and be expelled from school, but now he has become a police officer and is causing trouble. Detective Jung doesn't understand why Jung is angry even though Park hasn't contacted him at all. Jung wants to attack Detective Jung. They almost fight, but the other 3 stop them. Detective Jung believes that there is something strange about Park's death and the behavior of the 3 men who were his old friends. They tried to cover up the reason for Park's death by not allowing an autopsy and wanting to be buried immediately. Finally, one admitted that Park had indeed called him, but it was just an ordinary call. One didn't know that his 2 friends also got a call and didn't know what they were talking about. One didn't expect that it was Park's last call, so one didn't tell the others. Detective Jung still finds it strange that Park couldn't possibly contact them just for small talk. Ka-hyun gets emotional and almost breaks out into a fight, but Park's wife stops them. This woman said that there should be no fighting in front of the corpse. Mrs. Park was sad because she was not contacted at all before Park died. Yoonjin tried to calm the woman down. Long story short, Park's body was kept in the mortuary. After that, Detective Jung eats together with Yoonjin. Detective Jung is still paying attention to the behavior of his 3 old friends. Yoonjin said that Park and the 3 of them have still been together frequently in the past 20 years. That's why Taejin and Won were the ones welcoming guests and leading the funeral ceremony. After all, for 6 years, it was Won who helped pay for Park's child's medical expenses. Yoonjin asks Detective Jung not to discuss the autopsy anymore because Park must meet his son in heaven with his body intact. Park's death could have been because of his son. Even Yoonjin wouldn't be able to live if her son left her first. Detective Jung then questioned the guests who had come, most of whom were their high school friends from 20 years ago, but Detective Jung had forgotten. When Taejin and the other 2 men approached, Jung immediately gave them a chair. All 3 men were highly respected. Detective Jung then approached Park's wife and apologized for the commotion, but Yoonjin interrupted Detective Jung, who wanted to discuss the autopsy. Yoonjin offered to give a lift to Mrs. Park, who wanted to go home. Meanwhile, Detective Jung is left alone. Detective Jung then approaches Park's photo and remembers March 2004. Detective Jung has 10,001 that he is scribbling on, but then Detective Jung is called to the homeroom. The homeroom teacher knows that Detective Jung is the son of the head of the education department. Detective Jung was deliberately put into a special second class that other students really wanted to get into. The homeroom teacher hopes that Detective Jung can adapt quickly. Park then came to give the class tuition money. Everyone pays dues except Detective Jung. The homeroom teacher is sure that Detective Jung definitely doesn't know. The homeroom teacher explained that the class rule was that they had to regularly pay voluntary money to help classmates who couldn't afford it. Detective Jung was forced to spend his 10,001. After that, they were allowed to leave. That night, Detective Jung's father told him that the principal and homeroom teacher met him. All this time, his father felt that he was never considered, but at school, Detective Jung admitted it. His father asked Detective Jung to befriend a boy named Won and gave him a lot of pocket money so that Detective Jung could treat his friends. However, the first pile of money was money that Detective Jung had previously given to the homeroom teacher, which he said was for underprivileged students. Detective Jung was convinced that his father had just received a bribe. When Detective Jung was in grade 3, the homeroom teacher was angry because someone put an anonymous letter in the school supervisor's room and revealed that the tuition money he had been collecting was actually for bribery. As a form of responsibility, Park, as class president, was suspended for a week. While he was suspended, Park looked for activities and Detective Jung asked him to talk. Park feels that Detective Jung is trying to apologize because if Detective Jung sent the anonymous letter, then Detective Jung's father and the homeroom teacher would be fired. Park will be fine as long as he is friends with Won. The homeroom teacher and Won must have marked Detective Jung, so Detective Jung should be ready for the trouble he created himself. Detective Jung is relieved because everyone knows that it was him who caused Park to be suspended. Now Detective Jung sees Yoonjin getting a will document belonging to Park. Detective Jung wants to follow her, but another friend has just arrived. Meanwhile, Yoonjin is now taking Park's wife home. While Yoonjin was waiting in front of the elevator, a security guard came to give her a letter. Yoonjin offered to give the letters to Mrs. Park. The security officers also did not expect Park's death, even though Park's child had also died not long ago. After the security guard left, Yoonjin needed clarification because all the letters Park received were from insurance. Returning to Detective Jung, the friend who had just arrived and approached him and asked him to talk together was a figure named Jusung. He works in insurance. Jusung immediately asked about Yoonjin, making Detective Jung believe that Jusung still likes Yoonjin, but this man denies it. Detective Jung wants to know more about Yoonjin, who recently seems to have turned very materialistic. Jusung explained that Yoonjin was willing to do anything for money, even though her intentions were actually good to increase her income as a single mother. Yoonjin tries to pay for her child's needs because her ex-husband, who lives abroad, is completely irresponsible. Then Jusung asked if Park had met Detective Jung before he died because 2 weeks before his death, Park registered 3 life insurance policies with the audiophile company as the beneficiary. Jusung was confused because the insurance benefits could not be dispersed if Park was declared to have ended his life, but Park still insisted on registering. After registering for insurance, Park took him to meet a lawyer. Then Taejin came, so it caught everyone's attention. It turned out that Taejin had just received Park's will document and immediately read it in front of the audience. The total insurance is 5 billion won. At the same time, Yoonjin, who was curious, was forced to open Park's insurance letter. Yoonjin really didn't expect it because the beneficiary was Park's company Audiophile. In the will, the people who would inherit all the shares of the Audiophile company were Detective Jung and Yoonjin. Detective Jung and Yoonjin are totally in shock, and everyone is confused. Long ago, in April 2005, their class had 2 new students. The girl's name is Yoonjin, and the boy's name is Jusung. The homeroom teacher immediately explains the class principles that must be said every morning. Yoonjin bravely asked about this principle, which states that they must be people who can be useful to friends. In fact, all they need to do is make good friends without caring whether it is useful or not. Park was immediately amazed by Yoonjin, and the homeroom teacher couldn't say anything else. Then the scene continues to episode 3. Detective Jung tries to re-examine the oddities of Park's death. The only clue that is related to illegal drugs is a message that Detective Jung received, which has the code 1882. Meanwhile, Yoonjin is now hiding all the letters she received. Then she took Park's wife back to the funeral home. On the way, Yoonjin suggested that Mrs. Park consider having Park Junio autopsy because Park was not the one who would end his life, and an autopsy would explain what really happened so that there would be no more fuss. Park's wife became even more sad when she heard such suggestions. At the funeral home, Won is upset because Taejin knew Park had a will but didn't talk to him straight away. Taejin should have discussed it with the others before announcing it in front of everyone. But Taejin felt that sooner or later Detective Jung would find out, and if he kept quiet, then Detective Jung would become even more suspicious. By announcing the will, people would think that Detective Jung, investigating Park Junseo's death, must be trying to get insurance. Jung and another friend joined in the conversation, wanting to know why Park had contacted the 3 of them. Why did Park pass on the insurance to an unfamiliar friend? The 3 of them became increasingly annoyed, but Taejin ensures that Park will still be declared a suicide, and no one will get insurance benefits. Won is very panicked if Park's autopsy is approved, but Taejin says that with the autopsy, then Detective Jung is the most suspicious. Won doesn't accept it. He wants to talk to Taejin and Chae-hyun. Jung and the others were not allowed to participate. Jung is irritated and finds out that Park's death occurred at a construction site. Jung increasingly couldn't believe it. Won is increasingly uneasy. He is afraid that there will be a death certificate like a will that they did not expect. Won wants to know what Park said to Taejin and Chae-hyun. Was there anything else he didn't know? But Taejin and Chae-hyun said that there was nothing strange. Yoonjin then said that there were actually 3 people in the will. The 3rd person was named Lee Myung-guk. Detective Jung also just received information from insurance about Lee Myung-guk, who is actually also on the insurance list. But Detectives Jung and Jusung don't know who Lee is. This man felt strange because Taejin didn't mention Lee. Jusung has a little information about Lee and then gives the information to Detective Jung. Yoonjin, who had just arrived, wanted to ask about insurance from Park. Detective Jung is convinced that Yoonjin seems to know already that she will inherit from Park. Yoonjin couldn't dodge it either. She reasoned that she felt strange about Park's death and showed an insurance letter, which she did not dare give to Park's wife. Yoonjin asks for Detective Jung's cooperation to persuade Park's wife to perform an autopsy. Detective Jung can't stop thinking about Yoonjin, whose thoughts can change in an instant. Detective Jung then approached Taejin and his two colleagues and immediately stated that he wanted to carry out an autopsy. Taejin is increasingly convinced that Detective Jung actually only wants to target Park's insurance money. If Park is proven murdered, Detective Jung and Yoonjin are the most suspected. Detective Jung asks Taejin not to talk nonsense. The police started coming to see Park's wife. Taejin prevents Detective Jung from approaching, but Detective Jung doesn't care. Yoonjin immediately introduces herself as a deputy prosecutor, and the two cops want to bring Park's wife and Detective Jung. Taejin was immediately convinced that the police would want to investigate the will and insurance. Park's wife needed clarification. Taejin immediately explained everything. The recipients of the will are Detective Jung and Yoonjin, making Park's wife believe that Yoonjin and Detective Jung deliberately persuaded her to carry out an autopsy because they wanted the insurance money. Mrs. Park couldn't understand Detective Jung and Yoonjin's actions. Taejin tried to intervene and took them to the police station. Detective Jung, Yoonjin, Mrs. Park, and Jusong are taken to the interrogation room. The additional investigation was at Taejin's initiative. Detectives Jung and Yoonjin admitted that they did not know about Park's will. The police even cornered Detective Jung as the perpetrator who killed Park in order to get insurance money, because a person's will is usually intended for the family, but Park's death means his own family gets nothing. Detective Jung also felt strange because Park had never contacted him. So according to him, Park must have an autopsy first. After that, the police can investigate him. Detective Jung also believes Taejin is watching them. The police should have asked Taejin why they didn't carry out an autopsy. Even though many irregularities could have been investigated in Park's death, the police get angry, but Detective Jung becomes more defiant. If the police suspect him of being the perpetrator of the murder, then Detective Jung will be happy because it means the police carried out the investigation properly. Then Taejin entered the room and explained Park's death, which he thought was not at all strange. The family did not agree to carry out an autopsy. When Taejin wants to leave, Detective Jung gets in the way and a fight almost breaks out. Detective Jung believes Taejin was involved in Park's death. Their boss came to stop the fight. Their boss wants everything to be resolved without conflict. Moreover, the family had agreed not to carry out an autopsy. But suddenly, Park's wife agreed to perform an autopsy. Taejin was very panicked and approached the woman in annoyance. Mrs. Park explains that she wants peace of mind. At least she should know how her husband died. Even though she was sure there was no murder, she just wanted to know if there was another reason why her husband had to die, or if it was just because he lost his child. An autopsy was approved. Outside, one is angry because Taejin is incompetent in carrying out his duties as a prosecutor. The autopsy should never have happened. One is very anxious and says that if they had seen him that night, the autopsy wouldn't have revealed anything. One remains irritated, and Taejin should stop the situation from making things worse for them. Whatever the risk, Taejin will comply. Long story short, an autopsy of Park's body took place. The results will come out within the next month at the earliest. Then the funeral is held, but Detective Jung doesn't come. Jusung sent a photo of the current situation, and while waiting for the autopsy results, Yoonjin was sure that there was a reason why Park wrote his name in the will. Yoonjin will try to find out the reason behind it. Meanwhile, at the office, Detective Jung observes two adult men being questioned after fighting over yellow pills. This illegal drug has been circulating since 3 months ago and has a very high level of dependence. Detective Jung got all the photos of the situation at the funeral from Jusung. After that, Detective Jung joined in the interrogation process of the two men. The situation is very unhealthy. They refuse to admit to using illegal drugs, so Junior Detective Jung prepares a urine test. After the young man left Detective Jung there, Detective Jung immediately showed them a yellow pill which made them immediately turn aggressive. Detective Jung promises to give them the pills as long as he answers. They admitted to using the drug a month and a half ago. As the days went by, the effect became shorter, and it had been a week since the man had taken the pill. Since 2 weeks ago, yellow pills have been hard to get. The man now regularly consumes about 4 grains at a time. They immediately tried to snatch the yellow pills from Detective Jung, but luckily, another policeman immediately entered the room and stopped them. Back at the cemetery, people start saying goodbye, including the head of the property agency where Park works. Taejin and his friends also left. Jusung can't wait to be invited to join the investigation to find out why Park wrote Yoonjin's name in the will. Apart from feeling sorry for Park, he also likes being with Yoonjin. But Yoonjin admitted that she wanted to prove Park's death because she only wanted the insurance money. Yoonjin will use the money for her son to return to Korea. The next scene returns to the police station. Detective Jung and his team discuss the yellow pill and its side effects. The level of addiction is very serious. The more often it is consumed, the more dose the body wants. The body's nervous system will also quickly become damaged, They will find out how the yellow pill got into circulation. Detective Jung bios reminded Detective Jung not to forget to return the gun because the branch head had already called. Detective Jung then asks his junior about Boss Yun, but the junior doesn't know. The junior also got information about Lee Myung-guk. Previously, Detective Jung had asked him to look for Lee Myung-guk, but now he was declared missing from the station 7 months ago. A co-worker made the missing report. Lee was also diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Maybe Lee's disappearance was because he ended his life. At the same time, Yoonjin and the insurance man also discussed Lee. 7 months ago, Yoonjin was looking for information about internal corruption in a pharmaceutical company, and the one who made the corruption report was Lee. The director of the company where Lee works is Honam. However, on the day of the interview, Lee did not come, and since then, he could not be contacted. Meanwhile, Detective Jung comes to Lee Myung-guk's son's house to ask further questions. Lee's daughter and granddaughter are both researchers and drug makers. Nobody from Lee's company came looking for him. Lee's daughter handed over documents that were returned by the police. Lee's daughter also needs to learn about Park. Detective Jung then said goodbye but suddenly felt dizzy. The effects of illegal drugs begin to be felt. He needs yellow pills to help him. At the same time, Yoonjin, who wanted to go to Lee's daughter's house, saw Detective Jung lying helpless. Yoonjin clearly panicked and tried to help. Detective Jung doesn't look well and Yoonjin walks him to the car to take him to the hospital. But Detective Jung insists on being taken home and Yoonjin is forced to comply. When he got home, Detective Jung was even more helpless. Yoonjin saw the package addressed to Park. Out of curiosity, Yoonjin opened the package and found a yellow pill that she recognized. Detective Jung wants to know the contents of the package, but Yoonjin doesn't want to say. Detective Jung knows that it is a yellow pill and insists on asking for the pill, making Yoonjin lock herself in the toilet. Detective Jung is getting scarier and Yoonjin asks Detective Jung to wake up because what he is consuming are illegal drugs. Detective Jung's attempt to break down the door was unsuccessful. That night, a courier delivers a package to a mysterious man who has a facial wound. It contained yellow pills. Previously, the man contacted the doctor directly for the first time. Returning to Detective Jung's house, Yoonjin flushed the yellow pills into the toilet. After Detective Jung calmed down, Yoonjin started to dare to come out of the toilet. Detective Jung began to open up and tell about Park, who had met him 10 times before he died. Now Detective Jung regrets that he always rejected Park's apologies. If Detective Jung had forgiven, maybe Park wouldn't be like he is now. Yoonjin couldn't help thinking that the apology was related to an incident 20 years ago. Yoonjin then questions why Detective Jung could be addicted. Detective Jung was confused because he was kidnapped for 3 days and didn't know who the perpetrator was who made him the way he is now. He is very sure that Park is a property agent who is connected to illegal drugs. Yoonjin suggests Detective Jung tell the other police about his current situation, but Detective Jung refuses. He couldn't back down from the case because now no one cared to find out the truth about Park's death. Yoonjin urges Detective Jung to ask for help so he doesn't get addicted, because Yoonjin witnessed how a woman who was hit by a car previously died because of yellow pill addiction. However, Detective Jung wants to stay in the case. Yoonjin saw that the police and prosecutors tried to carry out cremation without performing an autopsy. Detective Jung asks Yoonjin to keep what happened to him a secret. If Detective Jung is found out, then the insurance money Yoonjin wants will be lost. Detective Jung also couldn't fall and asked for the medicine that Yoonjin had brought. Yoonjin admits that she threw the medicine in the toilet, which makes Detective Jung thank her. Now Detective Jung is going to Lee's house and Yoonjin wants to tag along. She will tell the information she knows about Lee. When they arrive at the location, Detective Jung and Yoonjin try to enter Lee's house together. They break the glass and start checking. From the start, they felt something was strange. It turned out there were no signs of life, but there was a room where every hole was tightly sealed with tape. In that room, they found Lee's rotting corpse. Beside him is a photo of a music club called Audiophile, the same name as Park's company. Detective Jung and Yoonjin realized that Lee was their senior at the club. Detective Jung then contacted his junior to come to his current location with a forensic group to see the condition of the body further. Detective Jung realizes that Lee had been frozen and buried after death, and then someone dug him up and took him out recently. That's why a lot of bodily fluids came out of Lee's body. They don't understand why Lee's body is now being removed. Before they can investigate further, they are interrupted by someone throwing a Molotov bomb into the house. They barely escaped the burning fire but were finally able to get out, but they didn't know who had attacked them. Detective Jung staggers again and Yoonjin panics. The sound of sirens is getting closer. Yoonjin decides to take Detective Jung away. They almost hit a junior policeman who was almost at Lee's house. Now, Detective Jung asks to be taken to the police station, confusing Yoonjin because they just avoided the police. However, Detective Jung still insists on being taken to the police station. After that, Detective Jung entered the office alone. It turned out he needed yellow pills, so he told his junior to buy medicine. When left alone in the room, Detective Jung remembered a pill that had previously been confiscated. Detective Jung is so weak that he almost loses his sanity. Limping, he tried to reach the drawer where the one pill was stored. Detective Jung can't fight the side effects he feels. 20 years ago, Yoonjin was a new student who went against the homeroom teacher's principles. Yoonjin was punished for cleaning the classroom and writing her philosophy every day after school. When she wanted to go home, Yoonjin heard music. Yoonjin approached the source of the sound, and there was only Park there, the chairman of a music club called Audiophile. Yoonjin immediately wanted to register as a member and accepted the membership requirements. Detective Jung, who had just finished practicing taekwondo, suddenly wanted to register as an audiophile member too. Detective Jung is happy because now the three of them are also in the same club, and apparently, Jusung is also in that club. Continue to episode 4. Previously, on the way to the police station, Detective Jung felt that the person who threw the Molotov bomb was the person who didn't want Lee be found. But Yoonjin is sure that the person who threw the bomb at them was the person who wanted to get rid of them. The discovery of Lee's body will lead them to the audiophile. The photo next to Lee also seemed to be done on purpose so they could see it. The culprit is definitely someone who knows they are in the audiophile club. Now Detective Jung wakes up and is very shocked because he is in the office toilet. He is confused and goes closer to the mirror to check his eyes. Detective Jung realizes that he took the yellow pill. He is very annoyed and goes back to his room. It turns out that his other colleagues are already waiting there. Detective Jung tries to calm down as if nothing strange has happened, but he realizes that the room has CCTV. He panicked because his actions would definitely be recorded. Detective Jung immediately went to the CCTV room and wanted to check something. He had to write a list of names, but there were no names of anyone who visited that day, including himself. Detective Jung then bought the CCTV officer a snack, but when checking the footage, Detective Jung felt strange that the video was cut to the part where he consumed a yellow pill from the drawer. Detective Jung asked the officer about this. The officer on duty explained that it was just a technical problem that often occurs when the electric current is unstable. Usually, lost recordings can be managed to be restored, but in most cases, truncated recordings cannot be recovered. Detective Jung said goodbye, but at the same time asked if anyone had arrived before him. The supervisor said that a junior detective had arrived. Meanwhile, Yoonjin gets a message to check the malpractice incident. The sender of the message was someone who knew that Yoonjin was a member of the audiophile club. Yoonjin needed clarification because the number also immediately became inactive. The next day, as she was about to leave for work, Yoonjin saw the daughter of the woman who had previously been hit. Yoonjin approached and invited the little girl to talk. The child was confused and asked if her mother was a bad person. Yoonjin denied it and tried to cheer her up. Meanwhile, Detective Jung and junior police have now submitted an interim report regarding the discovery of Lee's body. The case will still be investigated further. It's possible that the person who dug the grave had trouble bringing Lee back home, and the person who threw the Molotov bomb could have been the real killer. Meanwhile, Yoonjin is already at work and wants to publish an article about the discovery of Lee's body, even though his boss can't believe it because Yoonjin's writing contains too many conjectures and doesn't mention the names of the police involved. After that, the junior discussed the yellow pill. The woman who was previously hit turned out to be filing for divorce from her husband. They often quarrel and fight over child custody. But Yoonjin instead remembers Detective Jung, who is also addicted, and a child's fate if the article is published. Yoonjin asked them to look for other articles besides the yellow pill, so Yoonjin just took her juniors to another place. Detective Jung is increasingly suspicious of his junior, Kim Chang-soo. He wondered to himself had the junior known all along that he was addicted. Kim Chang-soo previously went to the CCTV room without writing down a list of names. Kim Chang-soo was also the first to meet Detective Jung at the station on the grounds that Detective Jung sent him the message. But who were the two people who took him to the station? Why did this person immediately send a message to Kim Chang-soo to pick him up? At Mr. Lee's house, the junior police officer was the only person Detective Jung told, but then a Molotov bomb attacked the main room where Detective Jung and Yoonjin were. After Kim Chang-soo left, Detective Jung immediately checked the junior's desk. It turns out he got a copy of the CCTV at the hospital. Meanwhile, Yoonjin and her juniors will examine malpractice cases at the medical center. The case they were going to investigate was only known to them as there were no further articles on the internet. They came to someone's house, but the child of the malpractice victim refused their arrival and did not want to discuss anything about the case. Yoonjin then left her business card. Not long after, Yoonjin got a call from Jusung, who invited her to Mrs. Park's house together. This man was uncomfortable going there alone, but Yoonjin had another agenda and asked Jusung to come alone according to Mrs. Park's request. Back at the office, Detective Jung questions the man using the yellow pills about drug distribution. The man admitted that he got the yellow medicine from a friend who had a tattoo on his finger. Apparently, the younger brother of the man with Scar's injuries had a tattoo on his finger. Now the mysterious man felt that there was something strange about the doctor. The man with the wound was sure that the person he called was not a real doctor, because the rule was not to call a doctor first. But when the man called, the doctor was confused because he had just been contacted. Even though the voice is the same, the speaking style is different. At the police station, a female junior panics because she has lost the only evidence of yellow pills in her drawer. Detective Jung tries to pretend not to know. The female junior then reports evidence of the missing yellow pills in her drawer and asks Kim Chang-soo for help so as not to be scolded. Kim Chang-soo approaches Detective Jung and explains the difficult situation they are in now. Detective Jung, who is suspicious of Kim Chang-soo, tries to follow the flow of the game. Detective Jung is angry because the missing evidence could be misused, especially since it was illegal drugs. The female junior says that they had already checked the suspect's blood, and Detective Jung asks for the report to be changed because without evidence, they can't submit the report to the prosecutor's office. After that, Detective Jung invited the male juniors to check the CCTV footage around Miss Lee's house. Detective Jung needs clarification about what his junior is actually planning. Detective Jung asked if Kim Chang-soo wasn't curious why he immediately left the scene. Still, the male junior admitted that he had tried to contact Detective Jung when he arrived at the location, but Detective Jung did not respond to his calls. Detective Jung also discusses the CCTV at the hospital, and Kim Chang-soo reasons that he asked for the footage just as a formality. Kim Chang-soo was confused about how Detective Jung knew, but Detective Jung admitted that he contacted the hospital, and they said the CCTV had been handed over to Kim Chang-soo. They again investigated the CCTV around Lee's house. Detective Jung still felt strange hearing his junior's excuse, which sounded like he was trying to cover up his actions. Did someone order Kim Chang-soo? Then Kim Chang-soo saw a car passing around Lee's house. Detective Jung asked his junior to investigate, but Kim Chang-soo had too many excuses because the car plate number was unclear. Detective Jung shouted angrily, causing Kim Chang-soo to fall silent. Detective Jung decides to leave. Meanwhile, Ju-sung is currently meeting Park's wife. He saw a sound device with the name audiophile attached. This man remembers that the device used to be in their club room. Now Ju-sung asks why Mrs. Park wants to talk to him. This woman admitted that she didn't have much information about her husband's finances. Actually, Jong-soo could help her over the telephone, but Mrs. Park had other things she wanted to discuss regarding the insurance that Ms. Park had registered for. The beneficiaries are Detective Jung and Yoonjin. Mr. Park's wife believes there must be a purpose. This woman knows Ms. Park needs to become more familiar with Detective Jung and Yoonjin. She feels that Ms. Park actually wanted to give her the money, but now Park is trying to bait Detective Jung and Yoonjin first to find out the cause of his death. A large insurance amount means a large premium, and Mrs. Park must have money for the premium too. In a different place, Won reads the latest news about Lee's discovery and immediately contacts Taejin. Won invites Taejin to a meeting. After that, the three of them came to a building. Won is furious that Lee's body could be in the house, but Taejin doesn't know what happened either. What is clear is that Lee's death is not a bad thing. It is even better than letting Lee emerge alive. Then Taejin showed the development project documents. For Taejin and the others, making Won the main leader is the most important thing. Even though Park dies, their friendship will not change. Won became calmer and explained that their project currently still needed investors. Taejin claims to have an acquaintance who can invest 10 billion, and Won will consider this. Back to Detective Jung, asks the police to investigate Park's death. Detective Jung wants to see the CCTV of the construction area where Park died, but the policeman asks Detective Jung to talk to the inspector first. This made Detective Jung suspicious that the police inspector was overly obedient to the prosecutor and obstructed the autopsy. The police then said that there was nothing from the CCTV that they found at the scene. The cop leaves, leaving Detective Jung with more questions. Then Detective Jung gets a wanted poster of the man with the streaks who previously took the gun. At this time, a man named Jinuk came somewhere. There was a computer in the room, and he was contacted by a doctor who ordered him to activate the computer, which was directly connected to the crypto wallet. Now they can make transactions via the internet. If the guy wants the yellow pill, send Bitcoin from that place. Jinuk can also contact a doctor via this number if the situation is urgent, as before. Another time, a man came to Park's apartment. It turned out to be Taejin. This man immediately strangled Mrs. Park. Taejin insisted on being told the passcode. This man strangled him even harder until he almost made Mrs. Park faint. Mrs. Park is upset because Park's insurance money went to someone else, but Taejin is also angry because this woman agreed to the autopsy. Mrs. Park admitted that she did not like getting involved with the police. Then she demands 1 billion won and will give the code that Taejin wants. Mrs. Park also threatened to tell the others about their affair, because Taejin should have divorced his legal wife first before having a relationship with another woman. Taejin didn't move when he heard a threat like that. He could only laugh while trying to calm himself. Meanwhile, Detective Jung returns to the construction site and wants to investigate the CCTV there. However, there was only CCTV at the front gate and nothing strange was found on the CCTV. Detective Jung continues to insist until the manager of the place shows him the hidden entrance that Park apparently used to sneak in. After the manager leaves, the shop owner greets Detective Jung, so Detective Jung buys the man's merchandise and talks further. Previously, no police had questioned the shop owner because they believed the death in the construction area was a suicide. However, Detective Jung realizes that the shop also has CCTV that leads to the street. When Detective Jung comes out of the shop, Jung sees him from the taxi. At the same time, Yoonjun wanted to pick up Jusong, who had gone to Mrs. Park's house, but the man admitted that he was already on his way home after finishing talking to Mrs. Park. Yoonjun wanted to know what they were talking about but had to stop when Taejin suddenly appeared, followed by Mrs. Park. They left in their cars and Yoonjun followed them. Back to Detective Jung, he investigates CCTV footage on the day of Park's death. Detective Jung is confused as to why Park came to that place alone even 30 minutes earlier before his death. After that, another car came. Outside the shop, Jung observes Detective Jung's movements. Detective Jung asks for a copy of the CCTV, and while they are searching, suddenly, the sound of a bottle falling is heard, but he doesn't find anyone when he tries to look for the source of the sound. Jung almost gets caught, but he manages to hide in time. The shop owner believes it was just the cat's doing. Back at Yoonjin, she realizes that Taejin and Park are heading to the same place. Yoonjin believes there is an illicit relationship between them. At the shop, the man who owns the shop admits that 6 months ago, a man who looked like Detective Jung asked about the CCTV in front of his shop. The man stopped several times at the shop to ask for a copy of the CCTV and gave him medicine from one's pharmaceutical company. Detective Jung then shows photos of the people at the funeral, hoping that one of the people who came was the man the shop owner was talking about. But the shop owner actually pointed to a photo of Park, who came to him 6 months ago. The shop owner just remembered that Park was also the one they had just seen getting out of the taxi. Then Detective Jung headed to his car while waiting for the shop owner to make a copy of the CCTV. On that occasion, Jung approached. Jung remembers that 2 hours before Park died, Jung dropped off Chae Hyun. Now Jung enters the shop and pretends to want to buy. When the shop owner was off guard, Jung killed him, after which Jung immediately left. When Detective Jung returns to the shop, he is very panicked because the shop owner is seriously injured by the flames trying to burn the CCTV server. Before he died, the shop owner gave a flash disk to Detective Jung. 20 years ago, Detective Jung contacted Yoonjun to meet because he wanted to discuss something. Detective Jung was too enthusiastic and needed to be more ready if what Yoonjun wanted to talk about was Park asking her out on a date. Yoonjun talks to Detective Jung because she wants to know if it's okay in their friendship if someone is in a romantic relationship. Detective Jung tries to cover up his feelings of disappointment, and then he replies that if Yoonjun wants to date Park, then it won't be a problem for the others. After making sure there would be no problems with the friends at Audiophile, Yoonjun left. Yoonjun and Park start dating. Jusong was also a little disappointed, but the ones in the relationship were Yoonjun and Park. Most importantly, they are all still friends as usual. Continuing to episode 5, that night, Jung was in a public toilet and washed his blood-stained hands. But there was an elementary school student who saw it. The little boy looked scared but couldn't say anything. Meanwhile, the death of the shop owner was immediately investigated by the police. Detective Jung tries to remember 5 minutes when he left for a while. Suddenly, the shop owner died. He believes someone was stalking him and fled in a car. The sound of the bottle that Detective Jung had previously heard made him believe that it was the work of the murderer. Detective Jung walks to a nearby location and realizes there is a car parked near the shop. The perpetrator observed from there, but the car that was now parked was a car that had just been parked. A woman came out of the house next to the car parked. She was surprised by the presence of Detective Jung, who was busy investigating. Detective Jung asked further and wanted to know if there were other cars parked in that place before. This woman remembered that when she wanted to buy food, a taxi stopped exactly at the position where Detective Jung was aiming. But she didn't know who the driver or passengers were. Detective Jung imagines the taxi leaving, but he only gets a few clues. Detective Jung returns to the shop, and the inspector in charge of the death case is upset because Detective Jung shouldn't have interfered. Detective Jung asks the inspector to digest the oddities in the case because the death of the shop owner and the case of Lee Myung-guk's body is related to the Park case. The inspector is increasingly angry. According to him, whether Park was murdered or ended his own life, Detective Jung has no right to be involved in investigating the case because Detective Jung is in the narcotics unit. The case they have been handling recently has absolutely nothing to do with illegal drugs. What's strange is that Detective Jung is always present in each of their cases. Detective Jung ignored the inspector's words and continued to enter the shop to check with the forensic team. He tried to guess the perpetrator's movements from the traces left behind. Detective Jung tries to imagine what happened at that time. The perpetrator did not prepare a weapon to kill, and in the limited time he had, he immediately took scissors and stabbed the shop owner. The perpetrator seemed in a hurry and seemed quite experienced in this matter. After that, the perpetrator burned the CCTV server because there was definitely something he wanted to delete. Luckily, the victim had time to move the data to a flash disk. So Detective Jung goes to the taxi stand. It turned out that there was an officer at that place who recorded information about his fellow taxi driver and gave this information via telephone to Jung. The officer said the name of No Guman, who has now stopped working. At the same time, Detective Jung had just arrived at the taxi office. Detective Jung contacted the shop owner's neighbor and wanted to confirm the taxi he had seen earlier. The woman remembered that the taxi was silver. It looked like a private taxi, meaning it was the taxi driver who killed the shop owner, not the driver who took Park to the construction site. Detective Jung immediately asked the female police officer, saying the number of the taxi that CCTV showed had taken Park. In a short time, this female officer found out that the taxi driver was No Guman, who was no longer working yesterday. Detective Jung asked for the person's address and also asked if anyone else asked about No Guman. Detective Jung immediately came to No Guman's place, but the owner of the rental house said that No Guman had left without saying anything since morning. So Detective Jung asked to be notified if No Guman contacted him again, and then he left just as Jung had just arrived. Jung panics, and after Detective Jung leaves, Jung gets a call from Chai Hyun. Jung explained that on the day Park died, they were recorded on CCTV. Detective Jung is close to getting a lead, but now Jung has cleaned it up and asked Chai Hyun not to worry. But Chai Hyun became even more angry with Jung and asked him to meet. Suddenly, Detective Jung returns home in a hurry because he received a package in Park's name, but the package sender is no longer there. It turned out that the contents of the package were yellow pills, with a note from the doctor requiring Detective Jung to take 2 pills at a time from now on. Detective Jung obviously immediately destroyed the pill. It's just that the temptation of the pill was too strong. Detective Jung is shaky and annoyed with himself. Detective Jung recalls the strange events that led him to his current situation. Detective Jung cries, thinking about his very sad fate. Elsewhere, Taejin goes home and gets information from the police inspector about the death of a shop owner near a construction site. Taejin then contacted the current police inspector explaining what happened. The culprit hasn't been caught yet, but Detective Jung arrives and connects the case to Park's death. Taejin clearly panics, but is relieved after the inspector says that the shop owner's CCTV server caught fire and is impossible to restore. Detective Jung also doesn't seem to have seen anything from the recording. The inspector asks Taejin to investigate the connection between Park's death and the shop owner's murder. Still, Taejin is annoyed and insists that there is no connection between Park's death and the shop owner's murder. Taejin asks not to be contacted again if there were any cases related to Park because Park's suicide case had been closed. Currently, Jung is being beaten up badly by Chai Hyun without being able to fight back. Jung made sure that his actions were not seen by anyone and removed all his fingerprints and hair. Chai Hyun doesn't like that Jung was killed, even though it would be enough just to remove the CCTV. However, Jung reasons that time is limited before Detective Jung returns. Jung is determined to do all this for the sake of his family and the 3 of them, even though he is not sure whether Detective Jung has seen the recording or not. Meanwhile, after the situation calmed down, Detective Jung checked the flash disk given by the shop owner. On CCTV that night, Park got out of the taxi and deliberately looked at the CCTV before another car appeared. Then Detective Jung contacted his female junior to track the car. The next day, Yoonjin felt uneasy at the office because she thought about Taejin's relationship with Park's wife. Yoonjin discussed this matter with her juniors so that they were convinced that Taejin and Mrs. Park were having a romantic relationship. They are also increasingly convinced that Park's death was not a suicide. Elsewhere, the 3 of them meets. Taejin opened the topic about the death of the shop owner near the construction site where Park died. They just found out that there was CCTV that they didn't know about, and fortunately, it had burned down. However, Detective Jung was on the scene at that time. When Detective Jung leaves for a moment, someone kills the shop owner. Chai Hyun admits he doesn't know anything. One was very panicked because the situation was getting more chaotic. The success they have been waiting for 20 years is in sight, but if one cannot become president-director, it will all be destroyed. Elsewhere, Junior Yoonjin begins to investigate in front of Park's house. Meanwhile, Yoonjin came to the medical center according to a message from a foreign number she received yesterday. Yoonjin met with the medical center manager to discuss a malpractice case 7 months ago. Initially, the manager didn't want to admit there was malpractice, but Yoonjin had proof that the manager didn't want to clarify what happened, so that the name of the medical center would get worse. Suddenly, the director came and saw Yoonjin's business card. Yoonjin introduced herself and the three of them talked. Yoonjin, who is good at talking and making up evidence, makes the director mention that the patient Yoonjin was talking about did not die because of the medical center's negligence. Yoonjin believes the medical center prescribed the wrong medicine. The director asked if it was the victim's child who told Yoonjin about the mistake in administering the drug, and Yoonjin confirmed it. The manager stated that there has never been a wrong injection of medication in the past 2 years and no victims have died due to injections from their medical center. The director felt that Yoonjin provided wrong information and hoped that she would not fall for the victim's slander again. The director prepares to leave and states that she is ready to meet with Yoonjin again if she has an official letter to cover. Meanwhile, Boss Yun's men brought a lot of money from selling medicine. However, they did not have any news from the doctor. One of them actually found the same wanted poster with Jinnik's face. At the same time, in his hiding place, Jinnik also saw the poster from his younger brother. The younger brother tries to calm Jinnik, but if Boss Yun finds out about this, she will use this as an excuse to make a direct transaction with the doctor. Now they have to be careful. At the police station, Detective Jung tries to record and sort the chronology of the various clues in his memory. Not long after, Yoonjin came with food. Detective Jung asks Yoonjin not to get involved anymore in this case because yesterday, the owner of a shop near the area where Park died was murdered. Detective Jung realizes that there was CCTV beforehand, and they almost died because of a Molotov bomb at his place. Detective Jung feels that something bad is happening when he approaches something. Detective Jung shows a message received from a foreign number claiming to be a doctor, but the person knows a secret code that only he and Park have known since high school. This number is the same as the number of the person who sent the message to Yoonjin previously. In essence, Park's death is connected to the murder of Mr. Lee, the shop owner, the insurance money, and the illegal drug, the yellow pill. If Yoonjin just wanted the insurance money to prove that Park's death wasn't a suicide, it didn't seem right for her to get involved in this matter. Detective Jung doesn't want Yoonjin to be a target, but Yoonjin shows him a message from the same number, telling her to investigate the case of the death of a patient at the medical center due to malpractice. Too late for Yoonjin to back out, she would have investigated anyway. Yoonjin admitted that she came not only because she wanted information from Detective Jung, but also because she was worried that Detective Jung might relapse and could be taken to the hospital. Yoonjin also has to investigate the malpractice case even though she has yet to find many clues. They still need to understand what Park really wanted by writing their names in the will. Yoonjin then asks why previously Detective Jung wanted to be taken to the police station even though his condition was not good. Detective Jung admits that he has consumed yellow pills from another user's evidence. He cannot control himself and will probably consume them again. Yoonjin couldn't stop thinking. Then Yoonjin got a call from Jusong, who had just found Park's company address. The three of them headed to the address, which was located close to the redevelopment area. They needed clarification because the address was far from Park's house. On the way, Detective Jung explains his last conversation with Park before Park died, which was about the matter 20 years ago. Jusong suspects that Park discussed the death of Kyuntae, their former classmate, and as a result, Detective Jung was forced to change schools. This seemed to make Park uneasy. They continued their journey on foot and finally arrived at a house whose address matched the address of their previous audiophile studio. There they found a motorbike parked and a high school student appeared. Detective Jung immediately said Park's name and was sure that the student recognized him. At first, the student didn't want to confess, but after learning that Park was dead, the student was convinced that it was Detective Jung and Yoonjin who were in front of him. They needed clarification, but the student invited them in to check further. Park told the student about 10 days ago that a police officer named Detective Jung would come with a female reporter named Yoonjin. The student needed to learn more about what Park said, and his meeting with Park was accidental. Jusong approached the student's grandmother. Detective Jung asked the young man further, so the young man explained that he worked as a courier and had never delivered yellow pills. He also needed to learn about Lee Myung-guk. While Jusong was helping his grandmother, the student told them that in their area, many changes had occurred. His grandmother also had land in that place, but they were cheated, and their land was sold at a cheap price. Detective Jung and Yoonjin joined them. It was at this time that Grandma said that she also knew Park, but recently, Park seemed quieter than before. Grandma wants to know where Park is and why only his friends have come. Detective Jung explains that Park is dead. Grandma didn't expect it and looked shocked. Detective Jung just said goodbye and left. Yoonjin and Jusong are annoyed. They feel that Detective Jung is heartless because he told Grandma about Park's death directly. They felt Park's death should have been announced at the right time. Detective Jung feels that Grandmother is not Park family and that she came out as a friend, but as a police officer carrying out an investigation. Detective Jung was annoyed because he came all the way that place but didn't find anything. Ju-sung brings up that Detective Jung always does what he wants without thinking about other people. Detective Jung's behavior now is like what happened 20 years ago when he had a conflict with Park after their classmate Hyun-tae died. If Detective Jung had paid more attention to Park, they would not have separated and Detective Jung would not have changed schools. Detective Jung is silent and Ju-sung feels guilty for being so blunt. Ju-sung approached the young man and asked to contact him if there was anything. They then went home, but a woman saw their departure. The ride home became quieter and Detective Jung asked to be dropped off first. Yoonjin was also annoyed with Ju-sung, who couldn't control his words, especially regarding Hyun-tae, their friend who died 20 years ago. Yoonjin also asked to be dropped off at the station. Towards the afternoon, Junior Yoonjin saw Detective Jung's arrival at Mrs. Park's house. Yoonjin gets the report, so she heads to Park's house. Detective Jung remembers that the shop owner said that 6 months before, Park had come to ask for a copy of the CCTV. Now, Detective Jung investigates Park's laptop or storage memory. Detective Jung's gaze suddenly saw a sound device with the name audio file attached, which reminded him of an incident 20 years ago. After that, Detective Jung started checking all the videos on Park's laptop. The content shows Park with his child. Mrs. Park needs clarification about what Detective Jung is looking for, but Detective Jung needs to explain something. This man realized that Mrs. Park was hiding anxiety. Outside, Yoonjin came with her junior. This man needs clarification about what Detective Jung is doing at Mrs. Park's house. Detective Jung was then allowed to go home, but the sound of the door code was heard when Taejin entered the house, making things even more tense. Detective Jung looked back and forth at them, who looked panicked. Then the scene shows what happened 20 years ago. That day, a student named Hyun-tae died, but Park seemed panicked and was hiding something. Detective Jung feels that Park's behavior has been different lately, and he is not opening up to him. Even though they are friends, he invited Park to talk alone. At this moment, Detective Jung expressed his assumption that he was sure that Hyun-tae's death was not an accident. There must have been an intentional fire that occurred. However, Park denied everything and left. The conflict was witnessed by another student named No Gyumin, whose hand was injured while holding the name tag Won Jong-soo. Continuing to episode 6, Yoonjin and her juniors saw Taejin come to Park's house. Taejin, who knows the door code to Park's house, makes Detective Jung immediately ask Mrs. Park questions. This woman admits that she told Taejin at that time. Then Mrs. Park explains that she was rushed to the hospital after hearing the news of Park's death at that time. Taejin came to confirm whether there was a will, so Mrs. Park gave him the door code. Detective Jung reads the lies from Mrs. Park and Taejin, especially since Taejin is a deputy prosecutor, so he doesn't need to bother to do fieldwork. Detective Jung feels increasingly strange about this situation, but he decides to leave. Detective Jung heard Mrs. Park ask Taejin to meet again another time, and then Taejin left and entered the same elevator as Detective Jung. Here, Detective Jung admits that he is confused about why Taejin came to ask about Park's death case, even though Taejin was sure from the start that Park had committed suicide. Taejin asks Detective Jung not to assume anything wrong. The panic on Taejin's face was very readable, and after that, he immediately left. Yoonjin and her juniors, who had been observing for a long time, needed clarification about this situation. Not long after, Mrs. Park came out of her car and immediately left. Yoonjin and her juniors obviously immediately follow the woman. At the same time, Detective Jung returns to the office. There, Kim Chang-soo was already who had gotten a little information about Boss Yun. Kim Chang-soo will try to find out more. Detective Jung's still cold attitude made Kim Chang-soo ask if he had made a mistake. Because this young man feels that Detective Jung's attitude towards him has been very different lately. Kim Chang-soo didn't know what was wrong and kept thinking about this. Detective Jung then asked on the day that Molotov bombs were thrown at Mr. Lee's house why Kim Chang-soo didn't guard the scene and immediately returned to the office. Kim Chang-soo explained that he hurriedly chased after the car that was leaving. Apart from that, other officers extinguished the fire. However, the car he was chasing turned out to be heading towards the police station and carrying Detective Jung. Then Kim Chang-soo entered the office and was confused by the chaotic situation. There was no one there, so the man went to the CCTV to check what happened and where Detective Jung was. However, when checking the CCTV, the recording was damaged. Detective Jung increasingly doesn't understand what is really happening. Detective Jung admitted that he was too tired to be sensitive. Then he left. Meanwhile, Yoonjin and her juniors caught Park and Taejin's wife on a date at a cafe. Yoonjin started taking photos while her junior served as a customer at the cafe and pretended to be wearing headphones, then eavesdropped on the conversation taking place between Taejin and Mrs. Park. This way, Yoonjin could listen to the conversation between them. Taejin is sure that Detective Jung will be aware of their meeting earlier. Mrs. Park was also confused because Detective Jung suddenly came to check various videos on the laptop, but Detective Jung didn't seem to find anything. Taejin wanted to invite Mrs. Park to run away together, as they had discussed before. This woman is confused because Taejin is now acting romantically, even though previously he strangled her just to get the passcode. Taejin immediately apologized. He made sure he would run away together if Mrs. Park gave him the passcode. However, Mrs. Park was confused as to why Taejin didn't want to divorce his legal wife first. If Taejin is divorced, Mrs. Park will give him the passcode and be willing to go anywhere with Taejin. Taejin had the reason that divorce couldn't be done easily, and with them running away first, his legal wife would definitely ask for a divorce. Taejin tries to persuade Mrs. Park, making Yoonjin feel nauseous hearing their conversation. From that conversation, Yoonjin learned that Taejin was currently trying to ask for a passcode that only Mrs. Park knew to open an account with a very large amount of money. They plan to start a new business and live anywhere with the money. Mrs. Park will consider that after they leave and the junior cannot follow because it would be too obvious and suspicious. The next day, Detective Jung comes to the shop owner's death ceremony. There was his boss, then they chatted together in the car. Detective Jung still blames himself for the death of the shop owner because he knew the clues and the culprit tried to erase the clues. His boss feels that Detective Jung is hiding something. So Detective Jung says that he got the investigation information from someone called a doctor, who acted like Park by showing the code that only they knew. Mr. Lee, who was found dead, was a drug researcher who worked at the pharmaceutical company Millicon. In addition, the prosecutor involved and the reporter whose name was written in the will were his high school friends. So all of Detective Jung's high school friends from 20 years ago are connected to the case they are now facing. Detective Jung will continue to investigate the case, and his superiors will also try to help. Detective Jung asks his co-worker for something about his gun. He wants relief regarding his gun, which is still missing and has not been found. Detective Jung is given 10 days to find the gun. After that, a CCTV officer near the station contacted Detective Jung to meet. Detective Jung was shown a recording of the two people who took him in, but then the earpiece dropped. The listening device was still kept and handed over to Detective Jung. Meanwhile, Yoonjin and her juniors re-investigate what Taejin and Mrs. Park said. They believe Taejin is the real account owner, but Mrs. Park knows the code. According to them, Mrs. Park actually didn't know anything about the account because if she had, she would have been able to withdraw the money directly. Taejin also did not mention the nominal amount of money, which was clearly very large. The source of the money is very suspicious. Detective Jung also visits a hearing aid shop to show off the hearing aids he found. The shop employee admitted that the tool was a product of his shop and that only a few people used it. The person who had the hearing aid came yesterday because he admitted that his hearing aid was missing. However, no names or contact information were known to employees. That person will definitely come again to adjust the volume. At the same time, Won is very panicked because he will be making a presentation in front of his father and other high-ranking officials. He almost took medicine, but Chai-hyun stopped him because he was also going to make a presentation. Long story short, Won explained the construction project, and the way he presented it was very similar to the style of Taejin who had taught him before. Won really imitates Taejin. Taejin has even prepared answers to questions that Won's father will most likely ask. Their project has great potential in the future and is very much in line with the mayor's expectations. They will position their pharmaceutical companies to create large-scale industrial complexes. Won promises to make the mayor's dream come true and attract many investors. Many people were amazed by his presentation. Yoonjin was also contacted by a child whose mother was a victim of the medical center's practices. Initially, the child was upset, but Yoonjin wanted to help the child get justice from the medical center and receive compensation. Yoonjin just wanted to hear what happened before the mother died. The young man invited Yoonjin to come home. Meanwhile, the police receive a message from their prisoner friend, so they set a trap. Back to Won. Won's father isn't so proud because the presentation was apparently Taejin's idea. The father was disappointed because Won did not develop. Won remembers May 2003. He had difficulty studying and was always making mistakes. Then a student named Taejin was brought in with the homeroom teacher. Taejin is a smart student and always gets first place, but his parents are cattle farmers. Won eavesdrops on his father's conversation. Won's father promises Taejin to have a lot of money as long as Taejin can also make Won the richest person in the world. In the end, Taejin will become a rich man next to Won. For the next 3 years, Won and Taejin will be in the same class, so Won's father wants Taejin always to help Won. Won was caught eavesdropping, so he immediately left. Meanwhile, Detective Jung suddenly feels dizzy. He cannot walk upright and his vision is blurry. The police inspector sees this strange thing, so Detective Jung immediately goes into hiding. The inspector starts to get suspicious, so Detective Jung tries to act normal and admits he's not feeling well. Detective Jung then tries to arrest himself. Meanwhile, Yoonjin also met the child of the malpractice victim to ask further questions. Then this man told her about what happened last year when his mother died of a brain tumor. The medical center couldn't provide chemotherapy, so the mother had to take lots of painkillers. But the medicine apparently came from Won's pharmaceutical company. But what was strange was that before his mother died, the mother suddenly had a seizure, broke out in cold sweat, and was babbling. The next morning, the mother woke up and turned around to wake him, even though all this time the woman had not been able to move. Then his mother died. The man believes his mother died because of the drug, and the medical center seems to have let go. The medicine that his mother had been taking was taken directly by the pharmaceutical company, not from the medical center. The person from the pharmacy is Park. The reason the man didn't want to tell Yoonjin all this time was because he had been paid to keep his mouth shut and not mind what happened. But the compensation money is very little, and by bringing in Yoonjin now, this man hopes to get bigger compensation money. Meanwhile, Won is attending a dialogue event with pharmaceutical employees. He was about to become a speaker, but things got worse. He was not calm, and his vision was confused until he fell unconscious. Shigen immediately took him to another room and told the other employees to leave. Instead, an employee wearing glasses forced his way in to give Won medicine so that Won could take it immediately. After being given the medicine, Won became calmer. The police have now received a response from the drug dealer and asked him to meet for a transaction. The prisoner was going to be used as bait, but now he is very healthy, even though he hasn't taken the yellow pill for more than a week. The man admitted that he took appetite suppressant drugs, which could help overcome addiction temporarily. After that, Detective Jung and the team devise a plan to catch the dealer. Since the meeting place was difficult to reach, they would set up a microphone, and since they couldn't completely trust the prisoners, Detective Jung volunteered to accompany them. Detective Jung will play the role of a person with an addiction, the prisoner's friend. They hurried away. In the evening, they arrived at the meeting place. Detective Jung is with the prisoner while other police stand guard outside and listen to the microphone attached to his body. Inside a building, there were already two people waiting. The two men work for Jinuk, the man with the scar on his face, but they don't believe that Detective Jung has an addiction. To prove it, they will give Detective Jung an injection in the form of a liquid yellow pill, their newest product. The other cops panic Detective Jung is in danger. If Detective Jung pulls his hand, he will be confirmed as a police officer for fear of addiction. But if Detective Jung allows the injection, then Detective Jung will become a drug user. The other police also couldn't do anything. It could also be that the injection inside was just a sullying solution to scare them. If they attack now, they will lose their evidence. They had to entrust everything to Detective Jung, and Detective Jung willingly accepted the drug injection. Detective Jung starts to feel high, but in an instant, his condition gets better. The two men believe that Detective Jung indeed had an addiction and asked him to continue the transaction. It's just that the prisoner snatches a yellow pill and reveals Detective Jung's identity as a police officer. The other cops panic and Detective Jung stops two men. One of them was caught. The traitorous prisoner also tried to run, but it was no use. He was caught again. Detective Jung also managed to win the one-on-one battle. Serena's voice begins to be heard. Detective Jung panics because there are drug injection marks on his hand. Detective Jung wants to take the evidence, but Kim Chang-soo, his junior, has already taken the evidence. Detective Jung was silent in confusion. Continue to Episode 7. Evidence of the injection used to inject Detective Jung was taken by Kim Chang-soo. However, Gong managed to escape and contacted Jinuk to report the current chaos. Now Gong will hide and make sure Jinuk doesn't get into trouble. However, the problem was that in 3 days they had a transaction with Boss Yun, and the money from the previous transaction had yet to be taken. Jinuk will set the plan and turn off the phone. Meanwhile, Gong's friend was being interrogated, but he seemed relaxed when answering Kim Chang-soo's questions. Meanwhile, Detective Jung is still uneasy about keeping evidence of the syringe. After that, the police gathered. The car the two dealers used belonged to another person, a former convict who is now free. Their boss also found no evidence of the injection that injected Detective Jung, as they heard from the microphone. Detective Jung says it looks like the man who ran away was carrying the injection. After that, Detective Jung was annoyed with Kim Chang-soo. Detective Jung suspects that the young man made him what he is now, but Kim Chang-soo denies it. He only knows that Detective Jung has been addicted to the drugs since the discovery of Miss Lee's body. At that time, Kim Chang-soo returned to the office and saw Detective Jung lying on the floor with yellow pills that had been consumed. So this young man cut the CCTV footage and moved Detective Jung to the toilet. Kim Chang-soo didn't report it because he believed that someone was framing Detective Jung. That was all Kim Chang-soo knew. Detective Jung said that the only person who knew was Kim Chang-soo. Detective Jung also confirmed the previous drug injection incident. Here, Kim Chang-soo promised to meet someone who had worked with boss Yun. The next day, Yoonjin came to the hospital wanting to confirm Park's real job because Park worked in the property sector, not medicine. And because to meet the company director, she had to have an appointment. Yoonjin insisted on waiting. At the same time, a high school student who knew Mr. Park was contacted by a number he recognized. He thought it was Park, but there was no sound and the connection was immediately cut off. This young man also couldn't call back because the number was suddenly inactive. This young man still remembers how he used to be a courier and Park was his customer who asked to deliver 2 packages. Boxes outside the cardboard must be delivered to the hotel, while those in the cardboard must be delivered to the medical center. Packages at the hotel must be delivered first. The student immediately left. It's just that because of the rain and being in a hurry, he had a minor accident, and he suffered a minor injury. But he immediately took the package and the cardboard that was scattered and put it in a plastic bag. However, he combined one package that was outside the cardboard with another package. A car approached and helped pick up a package that had been left behind. Then this young man delivered a random package box to the hotel. After delivering the package to the hotel, another package was delivered to a medical center that happened to be treating brain tumor patients at that time. At present, because he just got a call from the same number when Park called him, this young man comes to the place where he first met Park and sees Chi-yeon leaving. So this young man immediately followed the car until he finally arrived at the hospital. Chi-yeon immediately met Yoonjin, who was still waiting there. Chi-yeon orders his subordinates to take Yoonjin by force, making Yoonjin annoyed. Then Chi-yeon tore up the information Yoonjin was investigating and destroyed her laptop. After that, Yoonjin was forcibly taken into the car. Even though the woman screamed, it didn't help. The young courier boy who saw Yoonjin's kidnapping immediately contacted Jusong. Meanwhile, Detective Jung and Kim Chang-soo come to someone whose car was used by 2 previous dealers. The person is annoyed. He's a former convict but has now repented. He has worked honestly and doesn't want to have anything to do with the police anymore. Now Jusong is on his way and upset that Detective Jung can't be contacted. Returning to Detective Jung, the car owner is sure that the person who rented the car must have used the car to deliver illegal drugs. The car owner will help the police find the perpetrator driving the car to prove his innocence. Then Jusong arrived at the pharmacy office and forced his way in to meet Chi-yeon, but soon Yoonjin appeared barefoot and without speaking. Jusong was going to take him home, but Yoonjin instead asked him to eat without explaining what happened. Detective Jung, who had just returned home among the juniors, received news from insurance about Yoonjin, who had just been kidnapped. This makes Detective Jung panic. Then Jusong confessed to Yoonjin that he contacted Detective Jung, which made Yoonjin upset because he shouldn't bother other people. Yoonjin was confused about how Jusong knew that he had been kidnapped. Jusong admitted that the high school boy had told him, but he did not ask further. Yoonjin told him what happened before. Yoonjin was taken to the pharmacy office, talking alone with Chi-yeon. Yoonjin was very annoyed because she could not report Chi-yeon's actions, but Chi-yeon immediately discussed Yoonjin. Knowing that their pharmaceutical company had a problem, Chi-yeon believes Yoonjin is going too deep into this problem. Chi-yeon asked Yoonjin to let Park go. Yoonjin immediately showed Park's business card, which was very strange, but Chi-yeon said that Park worked for their pharmaceutical company. All this for one. To make a company that was previously losing money profitable, one's friends try to help. It happened that Park had an acquaintance with the director of a medical center, so the medicine produced by their pharmaceutical company was supplied to the medical center. All of one's friends do their best to realize one's dream of becoming the main director. Yoonjin felt there were too many oddities, especially now that Chi-yeon had kidnapped her as if to silence her. Cha-hyun handed her 2 envelopes, one containing money, but Yoonjin wanted to be more interested. However, the other envelope contained photo evidence that Yoonjin often received bribes. Now Yoonjin feels like she really misses her child. Detective Jung comes to join them. Yoonjin and Jusong get drunk and Detective Jung takes them. But Yoonjin and Jusong get sick and Detective Jung is forced to be their babysitter. After things calmed down, they talked on the side of the road. Yoonjin admitted that night Park came to her. Park didn't look good, but he didn't say anything and left. After Park died, Yoonjin wondered what Park really wanted to say at their last meeting. Yoonjin then discussed Park's wife, who is now having an affair with Tajin. Detective Jung also knows about the affair. Jusong clearly didn't expect what he had just heard because he was the last person to know all this. At the same time, his father complained about Won's condition while speaking at a company event. The next day, his father came to Won and confessed that he never liked Won as his son. This older man wants Won to go to America and never come back. Won clearly begs that he doesn't want to go and asks to be given a chance. Finally, Sang told Won to negotiate with the mayor and resolve the project permit issue. Meanwhile, Yoonjin came to Chi-yeon and returned the bribe she had previously received. Yoonjin also took some money to compensate for her material and mental damage. Yoonjin was fearless if Chi-yeon spread her photos. At the police station, the drug dealer they arrested still didn't provide any clues. Not long after, Detective Jung received information about a black car that had been recorded on CCTV and stopped for a moment after Park entered the construction site. Detective Jung immediately met the owner of the car, a woman who was quite shocked, but the woman was willing to explain what happened at that time. She headed towards her mother's house and stopped for a moment at the intersection because a man suddenly passed by. Then Detective Jung took the dashboard camera footage from the car. Meanwhile, at this time, Kim Chang-soo arrived at Boss Yun's place alone. Boss Yun and her men were packing yellow pills. Kim Chang-soo immediately entered and pointed a gun, but soon the gun was put back. Boss Yun apparently recognized him and continued to talk. Kim Chang-soo wants to know why Boss Yun got Detective Jung addicted, but Boss Yun was sure that it wasn't her doing. There's no benefit in giving Detective Jung medicine either. Kim Chang-soo asked where the yellow pill came from. Boss Yun admits that Jung is the distributor and the manufacturer is a person named Doctor, but Boss Yun and Doctor have never met. Kim Chang-soo looked annoyed because Boss Yun didn't keep her promise. It should be that after the police arrest the leader of the Ojiomipa gang and his gang, their city will no longer have a drug problem. But Boss Yun felt like she had yet to promise that. She wanted to get rid of the gang leader for other purposes. She promised to take care of the problem herself, and as for the dealers that the police arrested, it seemed like they were Jinuk's subordinates. Kim Chang-soo asked to find Jinuk, and after that he wanted to leave, but Boss Yun refused the request. Then Boss Yun gave the young man money. Unexpectedly, Kim Chang-soo received the money. Boss Yun said that the task of looking for Jinuk was the police's job, not her. After that, Kim Chang-soo left. Boss Yun wonders why the doctor drugged Detective Jung that night and took him to the underground station. Elsewhere, Detective Jung checks the car's dashboard recording and sees that the man who made the car stop was his old high school friend Sang Yui. At the same time, Won contacted Taejin because he was going to meet with the mayor. Won can't mess around anymore and Taejin will be here soon. But then Taejin is approached by a police inspector who shows him the results of their investigation. They saw a passing taxi caught on CCTV on the day the shop owner died near the construction site, but there was nothing strange. They investigated the taxi from CCTV because previously Detective Jung had said that the perpetrator was the taxi driver or his accomplice. The reason they came now was because they wanted to report everything related to Detective Jung. After that, the triumvirate came together. One prepares himself to read the information Taejin gathered before meeting with the mayor. Soon Jung came, making Chi-in annoyed, but Taejin told him to come. Jung cannot escape his actions in killing a shop owner next to the construction site. One is very angry, especially since Chi-in should be responsible for watching over Jung. Taejin also exposed Chi-in's lie, who knew that Jung had killed but pretended not to know. One became even more angry and hit him, making things even more chaotic. Taejin tries to calm down and stop the commotion until One asks for Jung to be killed so no one can make a sound, and Taejin agrees to kill Jung. This made One and Chi-in fall silent in panic. Taejin was the decision-maker here. Jung immediately begged them and promised not to say anything. However, Taejin said that he was only joking, although he would still keep an eye on Jung. Then Won drives Jung away. In a different place, Detective Jung met Sang Yui, who was about to go home and talk to the two of them further. Detective Jung accuses Sang Yui of being the perpetrator who killed Park, but Sang Yui denies the accusation. Detective Jung has evidence that Sang Yui came the day Park died, but Sang Yui admitted that night he heard Park contact the triumvirate to go to the construction site. After that, Park asked Sang Yui to come to the construction site too. Even though Sang Yui stopped him, Park still insisted on going there. So Sang Yui agreed to come at 11:30 p.m. He got into a taxi and continued walking. This man was almost hit by a black car, then went straight into a construction site. Even though they arrived 10 minutes early, Taejin was already there, and they were confused about why Park had invited them. Then they pressed the light switch until the place became brighter. Not long after that, Won and Chi-in arrived together. Each of them did not expect to be invited by Park and meet at that place at this time. At that time, Park was on the 9th floor, but they met on the 1st floor. Because Park had died by jumping from above, Taejin confirmed his death. The next scene shows the incident. In April 2005, Kyung-tae was suspended. His not coming to school made the homeroom teacher angry because even though he was suspended, he was obliged to attend school. After study time is over, Detective Jung, Yoonjin, Park, and Jusong planned to study together. One had invited Park to come with them, but Park refused because he had promised to study with his music club. Continuing to episode 8, still in April 2005, Park and his music club will watch a film together. Jung immediately reported to Won at that time. Sang is interrogated, his face battered, and one is convinced that Kyung-tae took Sang Yui's money again. Sang Yui also confirmed the accusation, so one takes his troops away without Park. They went straight to Kyung-tae's house. Returning to the present, Sang Yui explains that before Park died, they saw the lights on the 9th floor. They were sure that Park was on that floor. They became intent on meeting Park. Everyone was silent, but before they reached their destination, they saw Park's body fall. Taejin immediately stopped the elevator and panicked at what he had just seen, so they went downstairs again to see Park's body. Taejin confirms his death and tells them all to leave. They immediately went home because they were afraid. Sang Yui and the others didn't know whether Park jumped or was pushed by someone because they didn't check the 9th floor. Detective Jung feels something is strange, especially since Sang Yui and the triumvirate 20 years ago also created alibis for each other to cover up Kyung-tae's death. From Sang Yui's story, Detective Jung is sure that one of the people who came was the perpetrator behind Park's death. The perpetrator then felt that he had been recorded on CCTV in a shop near the construction area, so he immediately killed the shop owner. Sang Yui also just found out that there is CCTV in the shop next to the construction area. Elsewhere, one finally meets the mayor, who arrived late. However, the meeting could have gone better. The mayor refuses to cooperate with one because he already has offers from other parties regarding better and more promising projects. Moreover, in the past 3 years, one's pharmaceutical company has always made losses. Then after revealing all that, the mayor says goodbye. Back to Detective Jung, when he wanted to go home, he talked about Lee Myung-guk, who was their senior, but Sang Yui didn't recognize him even though he worked at the same place, just like Detective Jung, who didn't know Park well even though he's his best friend. On this occasion, Sang Yui said that he did not believe that Park ended his life because at that time he was the only one who saw Park die wearing shoes, but the next day the police found Park's shoes on the 9th floor. The next day, Detective Jung came to see Chi-hyun and asked him not to kidnap Yoonjin again. Additionally, Detective Jung wants to know why Chi-hyun killed Park. Detective Jung has CCTV evidence that Chi-hyun came to the construction site before Park died. Chi-hyun clearly denies this. Chi-hyun indeed came to the construction site because of Park's invitation, but when he wanted to go up, Park fell. Detective Jung, who is too busy with questions and knows a lot of things, drives Chi-hyun into a corner. However, Chi-hyun had various reasons. Before leaving, Detective Jung advised to tell Chi-hyun's other friends because it was certain that Chi-hyun and his friends would match their answers if Detective Jung visited them. Meanwhile, Yoonjin was still thinking about what Chi-hyun said that Park had connections with the medical center, so that drugs from their pharmaceutical company could be supplied to the medical center. That doesn't make sense since Park's main job is in property, so why would he be solely responsible for pharmaceutical drug supplies? Jusung was annoyed because Yoonjin wanted to get involved in a dangerous case, but Yoonjin admitted that he wanted to live a good life with his child. Yoonjin asked Jusung not to worry because she had been a reporter for 15 years and had gone through various obstacles. Another time, an acquaintance of Park's leaves and Jung remembers what his wife said earlier when she saw Detective Jung and Yoonjin leaving the place. So now Jung investigates the high school student's house further and is discovered by the grandmother. Jung is confused about explaining who he is, and his grandmother suspects that Jung must be Park's friend. Grandma admits that Park often visits her, and while Jung is there, Grandma will donate to the family Park left behind. Jung acted scared by suddenly appearing behind the grandmother, startled by the older woman. But Jung said that he would hand over the condolence money from grandmother to Mrs. Park. Meanwhile, one's father is experiencing a financial crisis and is having difficulty borrowing funds from the bank. One then met his father and reported that the mayor refused his permission because he was worried about their financial condition, which was always at a loss. An alternative to outsmart their finances is to get investors from acquaintances of company representatives. Meanwhile, Detective Jung is now meeting his police acquaintances to check the CCTV that is showing taxes around the shop owner's place. This policeman also felt strange about some of these cases and agreed with Detective Jung's thoughts, but the inspector had a different view, and he had to obey his inspector. However, in the end, the police wanted to share the CCTV. Detective Jung then invites his superior to look at the CCTV together to look for a taxi, only there is nothing suspicious. At the same time, Taejin accessed a cryptocurrency digital wallet. He knew half the passcode, but the other half of the passcode was only known by Mrs. Park. The woman admitted to knowing the passcode, but still needed time to tell Taejin. The reason Taejin wants the passcode is because he wants to take all the money in it to be able to invest in one's project. Taejin needs at least 10 billion won. But now Taejin has written the passcode wrong again. If it is wrong 2 more times, then the digital wallet will be deleted forever. Taejin was really annoyed. Meanwhile, Detective Jung comes to the clinic where people with an addiction usually go to get a prescription for suppressive medication, according to the prisoner's previous information. However, when Detective Jung entered, he met a former convict who he had previously arrested for his addiction. Detective Jung clearly panicked, not wanting to be mistaken, so he immediately left the place. Meanwhile, Jusum now visits a high school student Park knows. Detective Jung also went to the same place because he remembered what Jusum had previously said about the student when he saw Yoonjin being kidnapped by Chien. Detective Jung even accidentally runs into Yoonjin. They went to the young man's place together and needed clarification on the presence of Jusum, who arrived there first. Detective Jung and Yoonjin immediately talked to the young man about Chien. This young man revealed that he had met Chien once at the hotel because he helped Park deliver medicine. He got the drug from a place called a frozen warehouse, where he met Park for the first time. He went to the frozen warehouse again yesterday because he got a call from the same number as Park's number, but there was no response after he answered the phone. That number is the same number that has contacted Detective Jung and Yoonjin all this time. Come to think of it, the date the young man first delivered the package to the medical center coincided with the malpractice case. This young man admitted that day Park's child was sick, so he was asked to deliver the package. However, an accident occurred and one box was swapped. Next, Park came to him and was angry because he thought the package that was supposed to arrive at the hotel had not been handed over properly. Park even almost killed this young man because he thought he was lying, but Grandma stopped him. Then Park got a call from the medical center that the medicine was well received and had been prescribed to the patient. Park increasingly feels guilty. Another time, Park came to the house and gave money to Grandma. Park also apologized to this young man for almost killing him. This young man felt confused because it was the first time he saw an adult apologize to him. Since then, the student wanted to be friends with Park, but Park refused. He felt that because of the mixed-up medicine, Park was in trouble. After that, Detective Jung distributed Park's daily work notebook to Yoonjin and Jusum. Detective Jung invites them to discuss the matter tomorrow night at his house. Detective Jung also offered Yoonjin a lift home. But actually, Detective Jung asked Yoonjin for help getting somewhere. Yoonjin was forced to go to a clinic and pretend to be an addict so he could get a prescription for suppressive medication. Holding back their embarrassment, they then headed for the frozen warehouse according to the information from the young man. At that place, there was a security guard who initially refused Detective Jung and Yoonjin's arrival because they wanted to look inside. Still, because Yoonjin bribed them with alcohol, they were allowed to enter on the condition that they only look for a moment. However, Detective Jung instead opens one of the frozen rooms, making the officers angry. Detective Jung finds nothing and they are sent away. Only Detective Jung noticed there were yellow balloons. Detective Jung immediately followed the road around the frozen warehouse, which apparently was a one-way road near a construction site. Then Detective Jung received information that on the day the shop owner died near the construction site, an elementary school student saw someone washing his bloody hands in a public toilet. Detective Jung checked the CCTV further and was sure that the taxi driver they were looking for was not tracked by CCTV because he was avoiding it. The taxi took a one-way road that led to a place called the Frozen Warehouse, then turned the other way to avoid CCTV at the Frozen Warehouse. As a result, the taxi headed to the main road, and fortunately, there was CCTV there. After Detective Jung checked the CCTV footage, he saw the taxi they had been looking for, but the driver was unclear. Meanwhile, Jung wants to give condolence money from his grandmother to Mrs. Park, but instead sees Taejin just leaving Park's house. Jung realized there was something strange here. Then the scene continues to episode 9. In April 2005, student No Gyumin was at Kyumtae's house. They wanted to eat together and Kyumtae prepared the stove. However, because No Gyumin was incompetent in finding fuel, the oil spilled out. Even though the situation was immediately resolved when No Gyumin went to the toilet, one came very impolitely with his entourage and immediately beat Kyumtae. No Gyumin hid out of fear. In the midst of the beating, the fire burned and spread towards the surroundings. Back to the present time, Jung asked his wife's permission to go to the place of worship in his taxi. Meanwhile, Detective Jung comes to his house, but his wife says that Jung has already gone to the place of worship. Detective Jung was ordered to buy time for Jung's wife while other police tried to arrest Jung. Detective Jung was invited in and immediately checked another car belonging to Jung's wife. He admitted that he just wanted to have a look, and it turned out that the car had the same shape as the car recorded on CCTV around the murder scene. However, the police could not trace him because the car plate was covered with duct tape. The car also had scratches with dirt marks, and in the trunk, there was an oil hose. Detective Jung is convinced that Jung was the person who threw Molotov cocktails at them. After that, Detective Jung was invited into the house, but his behavior was very strange, so Mrs. Jung wanted to know what really happened. Detective Jung admits that Jung has done something and is now being targeted by the police. Mrs. Jung begs Detective Jung for help as they were friends before. Even though Jung has a criminal record, now Jung is no longer a criminal. However, because she felt that Detective Jung would not help, Mrs. Jung brought up an incident 20 years ago when Detective Jung incited Park to sell her friends to the police so that Detective Jung was expelled from school. Mrs. Jung asks if Detective Jung wants revenge now. Mrs. Jung's cell phone was out of reach, and when her daughter wanted to go to school, Mrs. Jung immediately grabbed her daughter's cell phone and called Jung to leave immediately because the police were looking for him. Then their child was taken to school by the police while the woman was taken to the police station. Detective Jung contacts his superior and explains what happened. Another time, the police inspector was upset because he received news that the taxi driver was the perpetrator who killed the shop owner near the construction site and had something to do with Miss Lee's death as well. Detective Jung has strong evidence and warns the inspector to be more careful in handling this case and check the CCTV around the incident area. Because of their carelessness, now this case will be taken over by him. The inspector contacted Taejin and asked to meet. Meanwhile, Detective Jung and his team discuss a plan to find Jung because they will take over the case. Another time, Yoonjin came to Detective Jung's house and found a package in Park's name containing yellow pills, which were immediately thrown away according to Detective Jung's request. Detective Jung starts taking suppressive drugs to get rid of his addiction. On the other hand, company representatives came to Won in casual clothes. Won is clearly annoyed because the company representatives should have prepared themselves so they could get investors for their project and not waste their time. Chai Hyun got the latest news, so the three of them gathered. Taejin told him about Jung, who was a fugitive and could not be contacted now. All of this is because of Detective Jung's actions. Won is annoyed because the permitting for the project is almost complete, and if Taejin is involved in targeting Jung, then all their efforts will be in vain. They have to hide Jung. There was something here that Taejin needed help understanding. Detective Jung has evidence that Jung killed the shop owner and is suspicious of the taxi driver from the start. They'd also need to find out what other evidence Detective Jung has at the moment. Chai Hyun revealed that Detective Jung had come to him and claimed to have CCTV evidence of the shop owner. Detective Jung also knows the four of them are at the construction site. Chai Hyun had no choice and told him the truth. Won is upset that he's only being told now, but Chai Hyun reasons that Won has an important meeting and doesn't want to make a mess. Now Won is very panicked and takes the medicine, while Chai Hyun doesn't know whether Detective Jung believes him or not. However, Chai Hyun was suspicious of Taejin and Won, who also came that day. Which of the two friends killed Park? Because as far as Chai Hyun knows, Won and Taejin are not the type of people who want to obey Park, let alone be asked to go out at night. On the other hand, Won and Taejin began to become suspicious of Chai Hyun again, making Chai Hyun admit that he was the one who killed Lee. Won and Taejin increasingly don't expect it, but Chai Hyun reasons that Lee, as a drug maker, knows everything. Lee demanded high fees and threatened to reveal information that Won and his deputy had an addiction. That night, Chai Hyun deliberately offered Lee a ride in a taxi on the pretext of wanting to discuss something. Chai Hyun wouldn't be able to kidnap Lee because he took a taxi, but the taxi driver was Jung. Initially, Chai Hyun only wanted to threaten Lee, but Jung instead beat him brutally until Lee died. After that, they stored Lee's body in a cold room in a frozen warehouse for 7 months. Meanwhile, Detective Jung and Yoonjin are confused about why Jung killed the shop owner and tried to remove the CCTV, even though Jung was not at the construction site when Park died. Detective Jung believes that Jung had a sudden plan after learning that there was CCTV footage that Detective Jung had checked. Detective Jung discusses Lee's body that they found. The body had been frozen first, but then there was a strong belief that the body was going to be buried, but it didn't happen. Someone deliberately brought Lee's body home, and it was Jung who threw Molotov cocktails at them. Detective Jung suspects that Jung received a threat to reveal the whereabouts of Lee's body, so Jung, without thinking twice, tried to eliminate Lee's body. To retrieve Lee's body from the warehouse, you would have to pass through the road near the construction site. That is, Jung killed the shop owner and destroyed the CCTV to eliminate evidence of their involvement. Jung seems to be with someone else that Detective Jung doesn't know about yet. The other person was Chai Hyun, who admitted to moving Lee's body from the warehouse on the same day Park died. Previously, Chai Hyun received threats that he had to come to the construction site or Park would reveal the secret about Chai Hyun killing Lee. So Chai Hyun immediately moved Lee's body and Jung killed the shop owner to eliminate evidence of their involvement. That night after the three of them met, Taejin met Chairman Won and they ate together. However, Chairman Won is annoyed because Taejin has crossed the line. Chairman Won knows that Taejin made the project proposal. This man also knew that Taejin seemed to want to create loopholes to spend money, even though Taejin had to know himself and stay in his place as a prosecutor. Chairman Won brings up his kindness so far, making Taejin beg to be trusted because he really wants to do business. Taejin tells a story about his father, who only sold domesticated cattle and died after selling land at a cheap price. Taejin doesn't want to be like his father and will try to make Won the richest person as long as he's involved. Chairman Won asks Taejin to know himself because he can replace Taejin at any time. Another time, Jusung bought a birthday cake and came to Detective Jung's house. He planned to make a surprise because it was Yoonjun's birthday, but Yoonjun came early, so Jusung hid the cake. Yoonjun was on the phone and then excused herself to the room. Yoonjun talked to her juniors who were observing Mrs. Park heading somewhere. The juniors were annoyed because they were bored of having to follow Mrs. Park every day, but Yoonjun said that they only needed the passcode that Taejin had been looking for. If the passcode wasn't found, they should at least know what account Taejin and Mrs. Park had been talking about and how much money was in that account. Jusung was very surprised to hear all that from where he was hiding. He expected to have heard only some of the conversation. When Yoonjun finished speaking, Jusung immediately slipped out of the room and pretended nothing had happened. Then Detective Jung invites them to discuss Lee's diary. There are records every morning and midnight of Lee meeting the same person in the frozen warehouse. But what is strange from this information is that the frozen warehouse has no workers other than security officers. From these notes, they suspected that the person Mr. Lee would meet was Sang Yui. Based on the information Yoonjun found, the owner of the frozen warehouse was Won's pharmaceutical company. In the frozen warehouse, Sang Yui watches the CCTV footage when Detective Jung and Yoonjun arrive. Meanwhile, Yoonjun's junior notices Jung's suspicious presence, but he ignores this. The young man contacted Yoonjun again, and Jusung, who remembered the birthday cake, tried to check on him as well as eavesdrop on their conversation. It turns out that Yoonjun's junior followed Mrs. Park's departure after meeting Taejin, but he still needs to get information. Now Mrs. Park comes to the apartment complex. Yoonjun just realized that the apartment was Detective Jung's place. Not long after, the doorbell rang and Mrs. Park came to Detective Jung's house. The juniors waiting outside are shocked by Jung's presence, which is very suspicious. Jung saw Detective Jung's car parked there, making him believe that Mrs. Park was meeting Detective Jung. After Jung left, Yoonjun's juniors immediately followed him. Meanwhile, at Detective Jung's house, the four of them talked further. Mrs. Park heard about this meeting from Jusung, so she decided to come to Detective Jung's house. Mrs. Park questioned the pension that Park registered before they got married, and the recipient of the pension was a 60-year-old grandmother. The grandmother's address had absolutely nothing to do with Park. Mrs. Park had never been to that address, so she invited them to go there together. Detective Jung suggests asking the police for help investigating the address. Then Mrs. Park discussed the insurance policy and previous will. Jusung had already discussed that, so he wanted to avoid getting involved in talking about the will anymore. Here Mrs. Park feels unfair even though Detective Jung and Yoonjun are not Park's close friends. Because the insurance nominal is $5 billion, the monthly insurance fee is also very large. Mrs. Park stated that the money belonged to Park, and Mrs. Park now won the $5 billion handed over to her. According to her, Detective Jung and Yoonjun have no right to get the money. Yoonjun protested instead that even though she had nothing to do with Park, Park himself wrote her name. Mrs. Park immediately called Yoonjun a shameless person after hearing the woman's words. This made Yoonjun even more angry. Yoonjun warned Mrs. Park, who should know shame because Yoonjun knew who the woman really was. Meanwhile, Taejin remembers Chairman Won's words to remain as prosecutor. If Taejin crossed the line, then Chairman Won might not consider Taejin as his ally anymore. Taejin remembers the day before Park died, he and Mrs. Park planned to go abroad. But then Park called and found out that Taejin was with Mrs. Park. Park immediately told Taejin to come to the construction site at 11:30 p.m. through the back door. Park threatens to tell everything. All this time, Taejin promised to carry out their actions until only 500 million was collected, but Taejin broke his promise. As a result, Park's child had to die. If Taejin comes, Taejin will learn new things about other friends. At present, Taejin gets a call from a payphone. Jung contacted him and immediately asked for help. If Taejin doesn't help, Jung will expose Taejin and Mrs. Jung's affair. Jung suspects that Taejin killed Park because he was caught cheating on her wife. Taejin was really annoyed. Yoonjun's junior also photographed Jung from afar. Yoonjun almost intended to reveal Mrs. Park and Taejin, but in the end, she decided to leave Detective Jung's house early, but Jusung suddenly came out bringing a birthday cake, making things even more awkward. Annoyed, Yoonjun blows out the candles, but Mrs. Park doesn't expect that it is Yoonjun's birthday. Mrs. Park immediately felt nauseous and she was annoyed and angry. She remembers creating an account with Park 8 years ago. At that time, Mrs. Park wanted the passcode to be 305. From then on, they had to use that number for the passcode. Mrs. Park couldn't believe that the passcode was Yoonjun's birthday. Mrs. Park makes Yoonjun check the phone she left behind and realizes that her birthday is the code to unlock the phone. Mrs. Park immediately said goodbye to go home. Yoonjin, who also wanted to go, received a photo from her junior. Detective Jung immediately panicked because he realized Jung was at the public telephone near his house. Detective Jung immediately went to the public telephone, but Jung was no longer there. Then moved to episode 10. 20 years ago, Detective Jung and his 3 friends watched a movie together. But Park got a phone call from Yui, which made the young man leave in a hurry. He came to Kyungtae's house, which was on fire. He panicked and wanted to go in, but was stopped by Won, who also said it was too late. In the present, Detective Jung contacts another police officer to tell them that Jung is just around his place. After that, Detective Jung asks Yoonjin for an explanation regarding the photo he got from Junior. Yoonjin also admits to following Park's wife, which is how she knew that Mrs. Park was having an affair with Taejin. Detective Jung becomes annoyed because Yoonjin's actions are full of risks, but after that he asked to be invited to go to the location of his junior, who was still following Mrs. Park's departure. Detective Jung asked the young man to record Taejin and Mrs. Park's conversation. So the young man came in, and while Mrs. Park was in the toilet, he left the flavoring by the seat. Not long after that, Taejin arrived, so the young man got into Detective Jung's car. They also heard Taejin and Mrs. Park's conversation. Apparently, it was Taejin who told Mrs. Park to come to see Detective Jung, but the woman wanted to know first what the relationship between Yoonjin and Park was. Taejin needed clarification as to why Mrs. Park asked that. Taejin also needs to remember that what is clear is that Park and Yoonjin were dating in high school. They entered the same music club and broke up after Detective Jung changed schools and the music club was disbanded. Mrs. Park, who asked about Yoonjin angrily, made Taejin annoyed and didn't understand, but Mrs. Park said the question was very important. Here, Mrs. Park admits that Yoonjin and Detective Jung are watching her. He plans to go to his grandmother, who receives pension insurance. Taejin asks Mrs. Park to stay close to Detective Jung and Yoonjin. Then Taejin asks Mrs. Park to tell him the passcode as soon as possible, because after Sunday, the money in the account will no longer have any meaning. Detective Jung feels that it is strange that Mrs. Park met Taejin only to confirm that Yoonjin and Park had been in a romantic relationship. Yoonjin also pretended to need help understanding what Taejin and Mrs. Park were talking about. Detective Jung knows Yoonjin is hiding something, especially since Yoonjin has admitted to observing Taejin and Mrs. Park leaving. Detective Jung wants to know about the passcode and the money they are talking about, but Yoonjin still needs to tell them the truth. Jusong was silent. He knew that Yoonjin was lying because he had heard the conversation on the previous phone. The next day, the police failed to arrest Jung. Not long after, the ex-convict came and gave testimony. His subordinates who borrowed the car admitted that they were not involved in drug trafficking crimes. The ex-convict was then taken to meet a dealer who had been caught, where the man found out that the person next to him was an ex-convict and the owner of the car they were using. The drug dealer became very afraid because he knew that the former convict was a very cruel and most feared person at the moment. Because he didn't want to die and be reported to another group for misusing the car, the drug dealer finally told him that he was working for his senior, namely the man with the scar on his face, or Jinuk, the man whose picture matches the photo of the person currently being sought by the police. The man provided information that Jinuk was a drug dealer made by doctors, but they had never met a doctor. The only person who knows Jinuk's house is his younger brother, who managed to escape. They also don't know about Boss Yun. They only know that the medicine is distributed in Boss Yun's name. For now, Detective Jung and Kim Chang-soo will split up to look for Jinuk's younger brother. It turns out that at this time, Jinuk's younger brother was withdrawing money from the ATM and realized that his money was running low. He contacted Jinuk and wanted to collect money from their customer, but Jinuk forbade him and asked his younger brother to continue hiding. If Boss Yun knew the police caught their members, they would be in danger. On the other hand, Won is surprised because Detective Jung is already in his office. Won looks annoyed, but Detective Jung wants to have a good talk. Won must have also known from Chae-hyun that he would be visited. Won did not deny being at the scene of Park's death. Detective Jung finally reveals a discovery that he had not told Chae-hyun. Detective Jung knows that Lee is a drug maker in a frozen warehouse and Park is the courier to deliver it to the person with an addiction, Won. But there is a conflict with Lee, so Jung kills Lee. Here, Won looks very panicked, but he tries to hide those feelings and admits he doesn't know anything. Detective Jung didn't give up. He pushed even more with the various facts that had been found, which made Won annoyed and denied everything Detective Jung said. Won is sure that Detective Jung hasn't found any evidence, so he comes to him. Won emphasized that he didn't kill anyone. Detective Jung admitted that he came only to see Won's reaction, who looked very worried about everything Detective Jung said. Detective Jung will return another time with handcuffs and excuse himself. Won was getting increasingly angry, while Taejin, who had just arrived at the parking lot, was immediately approached by Jung. Taejin gave him money and his cell phone that could only be used to contact him. Taejin doesn't know what evidence Detective Jung has to arrest Jung, making Jung annoyed because Taejin should have acted immediately like they have been doing. Chae-hyun and Jung are the parts that act, while Taejin is the part that makes decisions and resolves the chaos. Taejin was a bit annoyed. Jung became annoyed too and suspected that Taejin was the one who actually killed Park and created a scenario as if Park had ended his life. Then Jung gave a warning by saying that he would stay quiet if Taejin looked after him. Detective Jung gets a clue about Jinuk's younger brother's whereabouts. However, he gets a message from the hearing aid shop that the man who had previously lost his hearing aid has come back. Detective Jung remembers that the man once took him to the station. So Detective Jung cancels the meeting with Kim Chang-soo and goes straight to the place where the man is adjusting his hearing aids. At the same time, Jinuk's younger brother was determined to come to Boss Yun's place to collect money. Boss Yun's friendly attitude made the man contact Jinuk. He was sure that Boss Yun still didn't know his relationship with the police. Jinuk was very annoyed and told his younger brother to leave. Before this man had time to respond, he was immediately attacked and his cell phone was taken over. Then Jinuk threatens to kill Boss Yun if she touches his younger brother. Boss Yun gave him a choice, whether he came to meet Jinuk or vice versa. Boss Yun also wants the cell phone transaction the man used with the doctor to be handed over to her, so that his younger brother can be free. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Detective Jung finally arrives and the hearing aid worker gives the code. It turned out that the employee deliberately slowed down the process of adjusting the hearing instrument and gave it directly to the user of the device. When the man left, Detective Jung immediately followed him. Meanwhile, Kim Chang-soo managed to find Jinuk's younger brother's place but did not find any clues. From the trash box, there was a package with Jinuk's address information. But suddenly, Kim Chang-soo got a call from Boss Yun, who claimed she was going to arrest Jinuk and his younger brother. So Kim Chang-soo had 30 minutes to catch them. Detective Jung also chased the man with the hearing device using the car until he finally stopped at his shopping complex. Detective Jung goes deeper into the place but loses track. At the same time, Jinuk also arrived at the shopping complex. He went straight to Boss Yun, who was preparing to attack. Jinuk saw that his younger brother was helpless. Detective Jung saw Kim Chang-soo and followed him. He wanted to know what Kim Chang-soo was doing there. However, before they could speak, a gunshot was heard. They immediately ran towards the source of the sound. It turns out that in the secret room, Boss Yun was shot by Jinuk. Boss Yun's subordinates had also fallen. Then Jinuk took his sister away. Detective Jung and Kim Chang-soo just came and checked the place. Detective Jung remembered that this was the place where he was given the yellow pill. So he immediately asked Boss Yun, who was still conscious. Detective Jung asked Boss Yun why she got Detective Jung addicted to drugs. Detective Jung wants to know who is behind all this, but Boss Yun has difficulty speaking and ends up unconscious. Detective Jung tries to save her, but it's useless. Finally, Boss Yun died. Meanwhile, Yoonjin met Jusong and wanted to ask something related to other people's finances and accounts. Yoonjin, who didn't want to open up and make assumptions, made Jusong reveal that he knew Yoonjin was talking about Taejin's account, but Mrs. Park knew the passcode. That night at Detective Jung's house, Jusong saw Park's wife's cell phone passcode. The passcode was Yoonjin's birthday. That's what made Mrs. Park meet Taejin and ask about the relationship between Yoonjin and Park. Yoonjin was confused and asked how Jusong could know this. Jusong only explained if Yoonjin's question is whether she can have the money in the account or not, then the answer is she can't because Yoonjin did make the money. Yoonjin continued to seek defense by saying that the origin of the money in the account was also unclear. Let's say she found a treasure, and the person who can open the box is the owner. Jusong still insisted that it was not Yoonjin's money and should not be owned by Yoonjin. However, Yoonjin felt she was right, and she would still have the money. Meanwhile, the police are now evacuating Boss Yun's place. While the others were busy, Kim Chang-soo secretly deleted the CCTV footage that once showed his presence there. But one of Boss Yun's subordinates who had a hearing aid was keeping an eye on Kim Chang-soo because he knew who the young man really was. Currently, Yoonjin is on her way home when she gets a call from her child, who is going to school. The child wishes her a happy birthday and apologizes for forgetting yesterday. Yoonjin is sad but happy at the same time. Here, Yoonjin looks like she really misses her child. Returning to Boss Yun's place, they saw CCTV footage which showed Jinuk saving his younger brother by killing one of Boss Yun's subordinates, and then shooting Boss Yun with Detective Jung's gun, which had been missing. Someone who has an illegal drug business will be very risky if they use a firearm. Boss Yun seemed so threatening that she had to be killed. They guessed it was because Boss Yun was a big supplier of yellow pills. They believed Jinuk would smuggle goods from the doctor to distribute them abroad. Detective Jung asked Kim Chang-soo how he could be there. Kim Chang-soo gave the excuse that he found Jinuk's address and saw Jinuk leaving, so he immediately followed Jinuk. Detective Jung was suspicious because Kim Chang-soo came alone and didn't ask for help. Still, Kim Chang-soo explained that he intended to go undercover first to keep an eye on the surroundings and then contact Detective Jung after that. Then Kim Chang-soo took the task of delivering Boss Yun's only surviving subordinate, the man with a hearing aid. Junior wanted to know why Boss Yun called Jinuk. The man said that Boss Yun wanted to make a direct transaction with the doctor, so he lured Jinuk to come and exchange his cell phone with his younger brother. On that trip, Kim Chang-soo wanted the man with the earpiece to keep his involvement with Boss Yun a secret until he died. Then Kim Chang-soo promised to get the man out of prison immediately, but the man asked to be taken down now, because even though he knew the relationship between Kim Chang-soo and Boss Yun, he wouldn't be able to get him out of prison quickly. The man was also sure that Detective Jung would remember all the events of those 3 days because that man was the person who made Detective Jung addicted. Kim Chang-soo became even more angry when he heard the man's words. Kim Chang-soo suspected that the man couldn't keep his mouth shut, so Kim Chang-soo opened the car window and drove the car at high speed until the car fell into the water. At the same time, Yoonjin was followed by someone. Taejin also got a message that made him panic, and he immediately went to the internet cafe according to the message. Taejin then met Yoonjin, who had been waiting before. Yoonjin admitted to knowing the passcode and asked to meet at an internet cafe. Yoonjin got straight to the point. She could help unlock the account passcode. If Taejin doesn't like it, he can ask Mrs. Park, but it's not certain that the woman will tell him. Yoonjin also wanted to know where Taejin got the money in the account, but Taejin wanted to explain something else. Yoonjin then asks for her share and tells her the passcode that only he and Mrs. Park know. Taejin really doesn't like being threatened, and Yoonjin definitely doesn't care where the money comes from. As a prosecutor, Taejin knows many people who behave like Yoonjin. Taejin wasn't afraid of the threat at all and felt it would be better to ask Mrs. Park for the code rather than having to share it with Yoonjin. Taejin even rented the entire computer rental booth so it was just the two of them there. Taejin asked Yoonjin not to interfere in his affairs and not to talk about passcodes again. Then, Yoonjin showed a photo of Taejin and Park wife's affair. If Taejin doesn't want to cooperate, and the photo will immediately spread to news editors throughout Korea. This threat forced Taejin to obey Yoonjin. Taejin accessed his crypto wallet. He entered half the code that only he knew, and the other half of the code was entered by Yoonjin. However, the code entered still needs to be corrected. You have one more chance to enter the correct code, or the wallet will be frozen. Taejin really and immediately attacked Yoonjin. Taejin wanted to kill Yoonjin but was stopped by Jusong, who came and immediately saved Yoonjin. Meanwhile, the police are now evacuating Kim Chang-soo's accident, who apparently still survived. Kim Chang-soo apologizes for being careless. Then he said that the handcuffed man struggled from behind and kicked him, making the steering wheel wobble until the accident occurred. Kim Chang-soo is still fine, but the man who was arrested has died from drowning. However, Detective Jung felt something was strange because the man who was arrested was positioned opposite the driver's seat. It would be impossible if his kick could make Kim Chang-soo swerve in the other direction until he had an accident. Moreover, the officers who evacuated found the windows on the car already open, and when the officers arrived, Kim Chang-soo was already at the water's edge. Detective Jung felt strange because Kim Chang-soo seemed to deliberately make the water enter before throwing himself into the lake. Continue to episode 11. Someone called a doctor contacted Kim Chang-soo and disguised his voice. Since it would now be difficult to sell the yellow pills in Korea, the man would try to sell them to China. Jinuk also asked for help to arrange passenger ships in China. As payment, he will send 2 items that may be valuable to the doctor via underground courier. Long story short, the goods were delivered to the doctor. The 2 items Jinuk sent were Detective Jung's gun and a flash disk, and the doctor who received the item was Sang Yui. Meanwhile, Detective Jung has also heard about the incident where Taejin almost killed Yoonjin. Now Yoonjin has received treatment and doesn't want to say anything. Jusong explained what happened. Yoonjin admitted to knowing part of the code from Taejin's crypto wallet. It happened at Detective Jung's house, but it turns out Yoonjin's birthday was not part of the passcode. Jusong was very worried, but luckily, Yoonjin wouldn't be hospitalized. Previously, Yoonjin was almost killed but was saved by Jusong. Meanwhile, Taejin is now asking for the CCTV footage of the attack to be deleted. Detective Jung is also now taking suppressive medication so he can eat with Yoonjin, who is still silent and fed by Jusong. But Detective Jung reads Yoonjin's play. Detective Jung gives Yoonjin a message. If you still like this, then you will embarrass yourself even more. Yoonjin immediately changes to normal. She is alone and admits that she is fine. She only sprained it lightly and had only pretended to have a serious injury because she felt embarrassed. Yoonjin explained that of the 8-digit code, Taejin determined the first 4 and Park determined the last 4. Detective Jung is doubtful whether Taejin killed Park because if he did, Taejin would have difficulty accessing the wallet. But it could still be Taejin who killed Park because he thought Mrs. Park knew the code. Now the last 4 codes have yet to be discovered, especially since there is only one chance to open the wallet. Yoonjin admits her mistake and will introspect herself. It is possible that Taejin and Park obtained the money in the wallet from the illegal drug business. Going back to Lee's previous notes when Lee came to the frozen warehouse with Jinuk, they made yellow pills. Maybe initially it was only used for one who was addicted and Park was the courier. However, what confused them? Taejin had no connection between Won, Lee, and Park in this case, but he was able to get the account passcode. Detective Jung feels Taejin is the doctor they are looking for. Taejin started running a drug business with Park, but because Park didn't trust him, a code was made on the crypto wallet so that half of the code was only known to Taejin and the other half was only known to Park. Now that Park is dead, it means someone will take his place. It turns out that Detective Jung's guess was correct because currently Sang Yui is delivering illegal drugs to Chai Hyun. While elsewhere, Jung's wife secretly left the house when the police monitoring her fell asleep. The next day, Taejin suddenly met Mrs. Park and explained his meeting with Yoonjin last night, who claimed to know the passcode. Mrs. Park looked confused and panicked after hearing that information. They asked if the passcode is correct. Taejin became increasingly angry. He didn't answer anything because he knew that Mrs. Park's passcode was the same as the passcode that Yoonjin knew. Taejin immediately left the woman's house. In the midst of his anger, Taejin was contacted by Sang Yui, who discussed Jinuk and Boss Yun. Taejin was getting angry because they shouldn't have discussed this over the phone. Sang Yui apologizes and Taejin will determine the location for their meeting. Elsewhere, Won received information that the deputy director had received investors of 500 billion. Won is very happy. They need the mayor's permission. Taejin also received this information, but next the man's expression changed to surprise because Detective Jung was in his office. Detective Jung shows evidence that Taejin had called Jung. Taejin admitted that Jung called him because he asked for help, but Taejin suggested that Jung turn himself in. Detective Jung also wants to ask why last night Taejin almost killed Yoonjin. Was Taejin also the one who killed Park? Taejin looks very calm and knows that Detective Jung is just bluffing to corner him. Detective Jung then brings up Park knowing part of the passcode for Taejin's wallet. Detective Jung also believes Taejin is the mastermind of the yellow pill business and is now frustrated that more than 10 billion won cannot be obtained. Detective Jung wants to know if Taejin is the doctor who dragged him into this matter. Taejin is confused and admits he doesn't know anything Detective Jung is talking about. Detective Jung admits to recording the conversation and asks Taejin to be careful. Detective Jung leaves. Elsewhere, Won's father has heard the news of getting an investment of 500 billion won. He was happy and asked Won to prepare to meet the mayor to get permission. Here, Chairman Won also revealed that if Taejin wanted to participate as an investor, Won should have anticipated it. Chairman Won wants Taejin to avoid getting involved in their business, and from now on, he will ask someone to follow Taejin secretly. Detective Jung also now meets a former convict and states that he still needs help from that person. Because he has repented and wants to do good according to his late mother's wishes, this ex-convict man will help Detective Jung look for people related to smuggling illegal drugs abroad. That day, Jung's wife returned home and was immediately approached by the police. The woman made the excuse that she had gone out to pick up her daughter, but the police had evidence that the woman had left in the early hours of the morning. Finally, Jung's wife was taken to the police station for questioning. Elsewhere, Mrs. Park meets Yoonjin, and they talk alone. Yoonjin stated that she didn't know why her birthday was the passcode that Park often used. Mrs. Park said that she had been married for 7 years, but after her child died, her life became lonely. Taejin started to approach her and feelings began to arise that were difficult to explain. Even Park knows that he is cheating. 10 days before Park's death, his wife came home drunk and Park looked at a photo of their child. Then Park asked if his wife had an affair before their child died, but the wife felt that the question was not important. Mrs. Park also told her about Taejin's arrival this morning. The man immediately left after finding out that the passcode that Mrs. Park had saved was apparently the same as Yoonjin's passcode. Now Mrs. Park feels sad because she believes Taejin will also leave her, just like Park and her child. Now she must prepare to live a life that is truly alone. At the office, Detective Jung interrogates Jung's wife. At first, the woman remains silent, but Detective Jung said that the triumvirate would not try to save Jung. This information made Mrs. Jung say that when she met Jung earlier, Jung did not ask about their child's condition at all. Yang Jung asked if there was a call from Chai Hyun. Jung also told his wife to meet Taejin and Won. This woman realized that Jung was not worried about his own family at all. Jung is willing to commit crimes just to protect their crimes, just like the first murder Jung committed was because Won was the perpetrator. Finally, this woman asked Won for help, but it was no use. When Jung was in prison, only Chae-hyun and Park came. Now Jung's wife asks Detective Jung to arrest Jung without hurting him. After mentioning Jung's address, the police hurried away. Detective Jung asked another policeman to take Jung's wife home because she has to be with her children. After hearing Detective Jung's words, Mrs. Jung cried even more because she was sad. Long story short, the police split up to look for Jung, and when Jung realized he immediately left the motel, he went quietly through the back door to avoid the police. Meanwhile, Sang Yui came to meet the triad. One is amazed by Sang Yui because he is now a medicine maker and drug delivery man. But one is annoyed because Sang Yui met Detective Jung without telling him. One asks Sang Yui to be more careful next time when he says something to Detective Jung. Sang Yui has to be brave with Detective Jung because one is always behind him. Taejin comes and they start drinking together. But because Taejin wanted to discuss something, Sang Yui was sent away. Sang Yui left his cell phone in his jacket, which recorded the conversation without the others realizing. The three of them started discussing Jung, who was declared a suspect in Lee's murder and the owner of a shop near the construction site. The problem is that if the case escalates, the police will find out the reason for the murder, and they will all be in danger. Taejin proposes to kill Jung. Chae-hyun immediately refuses because he is very close to Jung. This made Taejin annoyed with Chae-hyun because he was the mastermind behind Lee Min-guk's death. Taejin starts bringing up other mistakes and accuses Chae-hyun. Taejin's attitude made Chae-hyun's emotions explode. One became angry because the final decision was in his hands, and Taejin always seemed to be ordering him. One wants them to remain calm and not rush into decisions. Meanwhile, Jung, who is still on the run, gets a voice message from a foreign number. The message contained a conversation from the triad who intended to kill him. Jung immediately panicked. Another message appeared and said that evidence of Taejin killing Park was at Park's house. So Jung will go straight to Park's house. The police also started tracking the movement of Jung's cell phone, which was getting farther and farther away. When Jung arrived in front of Park's house, he contacted Chae-hyun and was confused as to why Chae-hyun didn't immediately contact him when Taejin intended to kill him. Chae-hyun is confused about how Jung could know that. Jung said that all of this was Taejin's plan and they shouldn't fall for Taejin's words. Jung promises to prove that Taejin is Park's killer. Jung asks Chae-hyun to tell Taejin not to mess with him because now the choice is for them to die together or live together. Chae-hyun was very panicked because Jung didn't explain his whereabouts. Elsewhere, Detective Jung starts to feel dizzy and gets the latest information on the whereabouts of Jung's cell phone. Detective Jung remembered that the location was in the area of Park's house. Currently, Mrs. Park is confused about Jung's arrival, who claims he wants to discuss Park. Mrs. Park also didn't realize Detective Jung was contacting her. When they were talking alone, Jung began to bring up Park's kindness so far. In the past, it was Park who invited him to work at Won's company, but then the first case started when a leader scolded Won. Jung did not accept committing his first murder while drunk. The problem was, while he was in prison, Park often came to him. Park was also the one who found him a job as a taxi driver. Mrs. Park started to panic and get scared. She tried to chase Jung away, but Jung kept talking, questioning why Mrs. Park was cheating on Taejin and betraying Park, who had always been very good. Jung is sure that Mrs. Park and Taejin are the ones who killed Park and asks for the evidence hidden in the house. Jung is getting scared. The police finally arrived at Park's house, but there was already a trail of blood. Detective Jung immediately contacted Taejin to find out the door code to Park's house. After successfully entering the house, they found Mrs. Park covered in blood and unconscious but still breathing. Detective Jung immediately chases Jung based on the trail of blood left behind. It's just that the effects of the addiction are starting to be felt again. Detective Jung almost consumed the yellow emergency pill he kept in his pocket. Detective Jung tries to calm himself down and tries to convince himself that he can overcome his dependence on the drug. Meanwhile, at the criminal division office, they receive information that the dealer arrested by the narcotics team was apparently related to their other case, so they will handle the dealers because so far the narcotics team has always seized their cases. The drug dealer was treated very well. He praises Detective Jung's greatness, making the inspector annoyed because he thinks Detective Jung is nothing great. The dealer said that Detective Jung was great because he was very strong, he could withstand the effects of illegal drugs. The police became increasingly curious. The dealer also explained that they had injected Detective Jung with illegal drugs to determine whether Detective Jung was a policeman or not. Usually, the first person to consume it would faint, but Detective Jung just accepted it as if Detective Jung had an addiction too. Even Detective Jung can fight and win a fight with him. The police increasingly couldn't believe what they heard. Meanwhile, Mrs. Park was taken to the hospital. The police could no longer find Jung's whereabouts. They also need to find out why Jung came to Park's house, but the crime scene is very messy as if Jung was looking for something. Detective Jung will check into the hospital where Mrs. Park is being treated. On the other hand, the laundry owner gave Yoonjin a letter that was in her coat pocket. Yoonjin remembered that there was a letter that he had not seen on the day Park died. Yoonjin hurriedly left while Detective Jung now started taking suppressive medication and then waited for Mrs. Park, who was declared to have a mild concussion. Detective Jung's unhealthy-looking condition worries the doctor, but Detective Jung only admits that he is exhausted. Taejin then appears and Detective Jung immediately hits him. Detective Jung believes Taejin told Jung to kill Mrs. Park. Detective Jung is confused about what Taejin wants and who else needs to die to make Taejin feel better. Detective Jung immediately accuses Taejin of selling illegal drugs with Park in a frozen warehouse and orders Lee as the manufacturer. Then Taejin killed Lee and Park, and after that he ordered Jung to kill the shop owner near the construction site, and now he's trying to kill his mistress. Detective Jung is confused about why he had to get involved in Taejin's problem. Here, Taejin doesn't understand what Detective Jung is talking about and he immediately beats him back. Taejin is confused by Detective Jung's weak condition. Taejin also admitted that he had no reason to kill Park and his wife. Taejin even admitted he didn't have an affair with Mrs. Park because of the passcode. Even Mrs. Park doesn't know anything about their affairs. Taejin doesn't like being accused of selling illegal drugs. Detective Jung has no evidence to accuse him. If Detective Jung touches him again, then he will make sure Detective Jung is fired from the police force. Yoonjin came and immediately slapped Taejin as revenge for almost being killed before. 20 years ago, Detective Jung was expelled from school and transferred to a new school after opposing Won and his group. Park defended them because Won's father met Park's father. Actually, Won is still annoying with Park, but Taejin has his thoughts because Taejin is the smartest kid among the others. So Won usually makes decisions based on considerations from Taejin, who at that time felt there was no need to prolong the problem. According to Taejin, their business was finished because Detective Jung had changed schools at that time. Won complies, but Sang-Yue protests because Park and Yoonjin are still dating. That night, Yoonjin got a message from Park to go to the audiophile room, but Park destroyed the room and asked Yoonjin not to say anything to him anymore. Sang-Yue watched them with pleasure. Then we are taken to episode 12. Detective Jung is increasingly helpless. He felt that the suppressive medication was no longer effective. Even taking 8 pills had no effect. Yoonjin was clearly shocked because she knew that taking too much medicine could damage the liver. Yoonjin arrived at the hospital because she wanted to ask the doctor who treated Park's child. Yoonjin doesn't even know that Park's wife is currently being treated for injuries caused by Jung. Yoonjin then told Detective Jung to go home and rest. At the same time, the triumvirate gathered again. Taejin tells them that Jung tried to kill Mrs. Park but failed and is now trying to escape. That's why Taejin really wants to kill Jung. They didn't act quickly, and now Jung is difficult to control. Won clearly doesn't accept being blamed even though he was the one who made the decision, but killing his friend is not an easy thing to do. If Jung is left alone, the police will soon arrest him and they will all be destroyed. Chae-hyun also admitted that he previously received a call from Jung who spoke as if he had just listened to a recording file. Jung knows that he wants to be killed and says that this is all Taejin's doing. They were all played by Taejin. Chae-hyun wants to know whether Taejin is having an affair with Mrs. Park. Won clearly didn't expect it and Taejin couldn't avoid it anymore. Not long after, Won was contacted by Jung who asked for help. Jung calls Taejin the person who tried to kill him. Taejin also killed Park to cover up his affair. Jung has searched Park's house but hasn't found any evidence because the police have arrived. Jung also asked Won not to tell Chae-hyun because it seemed like Chae-hyun was conspiring with Taejin. Jung didn't realize that Chae-hyun and Taejin were there listening to their conversation. Won wonders what will happen if he can't help. Jung has no choice. He will turn himself in as Lee's killer on orders from Won, who is addicted to drugs. Won immediately panics. Jung also doesn't want to hide. He has a family and wants to have his own business. Jung brought up the principle when they were in high school, namely being a person who is useful to friends. Then Won invites Jung to talk to him face to face. Now the three of them are starting to split. Taejin admitted that he had a relationship with Mrs. Park, but he was not the one who killed Park. Chae-hyun was confused as to why Taejin didn't investigate Park's death directly from the start and always refused to carry out an autopsy. Taejin reasons that it's too late to investigate because Detective Jung has already intervened. Taejin also felt that there was a possibility that Park was actually murdered. Taejin then grilled Won and Chae-hyun to ask Park what their sins were until Park had to call them to the construction site. Before he died, Park threatened Won for using illegal drugs and threatened Chae-hyun for killing Lee. Chae-hyun wants to know what Park's threat to Taejin is, but Taejin instead says that it seems like Park's goal in inheriting insurance for Detective Jung and Yoonjin is just so that they are divided and don't trust each other like now. The three of them have strong reasons for killing Park, but they were not the perpetrators. They should work together to find the real culprit instead of fighting each other. One agreed to kill Jung, but Chae-hyun refused. The next day, Jung came to a car as promised with One. When he entered, Chae-hyun immediately strangled him. Jung realized that he was tied up, and it turned out that he was going to be buried by Chae-hyun. Jung asks for help because they are friends. Jung tries to negotiate and is sure that Chae-hyun is not considered a friend by Taejin and One. Chae-hyun is only called when needed. In fact, all this time, Jung was willing to commit crimes to protect One, so that he could be considered a triumvirate too. Jung was jealous of Chae-hyun, but because he talked too much, Chae-hyun hit him. Meanwhile, Yoonjin meets the doctor who used to treat Park's children. Yoonjin showed the letter that was previously in the envelope. The doctor said that Park's child could actually be cured in America, but it would be very expensive and not covered by insurance. The cost is around 500 million won. Park once said he would get the money somehow. Back in the forest, Jung is still alive, and Chae-hyun will let Jung live as long as he never comes around them again. Chae-hyun breaks off their friendship. Jung doesn't want to. He shouts, stating the principle that the homeroom teacher had previously taught be useful to friends. Then, other people see Chae-hyun beraying the ground and throw a bloody shoe. All this makes the person panic. Meanwhile, Detective Jung's superior becomes suspicious of Kim Chang-soo, whose condition is now fine. Yoonjin then came to Detective Jung's house. There's a package in Park's name, and Detective Jung doesn't respond to calls either. Yoonjin remembered the door code to the house, and she managed to enter. Yoonjin immediately saw Detective Jung lying helpless. Yoonjin panicked and tried to give him drinking water, but it didn't help anything. Detective Jung's dire condition made Yoonjin open the package containing the yellow pills. Returning to the police station, the boss received information from a former convict regarding 3 ports in China that were commonly used for illegal drug transactions. They still don't know which port will be the place for the yellow pill transaction. Meanwhile, Yoonjin is currently looking at a yellow pill that has disappeared. Then, this woman immediately threw away the other 3 pills. Detective Jung, who had regained consciousness, checked his eyes and was immediately angry because Yoonjin made him take the yellow pill again. Still, Yoonjin had no other choice when she saw Detective Jung's terrible condition. Then Detective Jung read a message from the doctor telling him to go to the port the day after tomorrow at 4:00 a.m. Detective Jung contacted his superior and mentioned the name of the port according to the doctor's information. This port was on the list of 3 ports that the former convict mentioned. The superior will focus on the port the day after tomorrow at 4:00 a.m. Yoonjin still apologizes, but Detective Jung is sure that Yoonjin must be too hesitant and confused to help him. Detective Jung believes that what Yoonjin has done is the best choice. Yoonjin then talked about Grandma getting Park's pension insurance. Yoonjin invites him to go there, but Detective Jung has other business and will go to see Sang Yui. Detective Jung is actually targeting Taejin, but because Taejin is a prosecutor, information will be difficult to get. Detective Jung also invites Yoonjin to go somewhere else. Sang Yui contacted Jinuk and told him about the ship that Jinuk would be traveling on at the port the day after tomorrow. Then Sang Yui removed his voice changer and now uses his original voice but claims to be Taejin. Jinuk also remembered that 1 year ago he had met Taejin because he was involved in a prostitution case, but Jinuk handed over the flash disk and was free from all charges. Now Sang Yui, who claims to be Taejin, is happy because he got a flash disk for the second time. The contents are photos of secret customers. Jinuk is very confused and asks why the doctor revealed his identity as Taejin. Sang Yui admitted that he had a reason why Jinuk was chosen as the person who distributed the drugs, even though Jinuk had never sold illegal drugs before. If this is handled directly by Boss Yun, the doctor who is in danger, because Boss Yun is not an easy person to deal with. Jinuk needed clarification as to why he was told all the doctor's secrets. Sang Yui reasoned that if Jinuk suddenly decided to leave now, and the doctor wouldn't have the chance to say anything else. Then Sang Yui ended the telephone call. After that, Sang Yui left and Detective Jung, who saw him leaving, immediately followed him. One also now takes his medicine before meeting the mayor. One explains all his projects and the 500 billion in investor funds he just got. The mayor was very happy and finally permitted One's project. Detective Jung and Yoonjin then saw Sang Yui enter the restaurant. But because they rented a special room, Detective Jung and Yoonjin go to the back and see that Taejin is the person Sang Yui met. Because they didn't know what Sang Yui and Taejin were talking about, Yoonjin took out his eavesdropping equipment. Taejin immediately discussed the previous triumvirate meeting and knew that Sang Yui was the one who recorded the chat secretly. After that, he told Jung about their conversation. Taejin brings up that Sang Yui would have no one if Park hadn't sided with Sang Yui in the past and made Sang Yui the class secretary. Sang Yui should be aware of himself because now Park is not there. Sang Yui should have been nice to him, but instead, Sang Yui sided with Detective Jung. Sang Yui denied all of Taejin's accusations. He doesn't know anything about recording, but Taejin is too smart for Sang Yui. He'll lie to him. Taejin felt strange because Sang Yui seemed to have a grudge against him, even though Taejin had never done anything to Sang Yui like the other children. Moreover, Sang Yui also thinks that Taejin killed Park. Sang Yui remembered Park's words that he only wanted to earn 500 million, and after that, he quit the business to take his son to America for surgery. Taejin realized that he was being trapped. Then Taejin checked Sang Yui's cell phone, which had been recording their conversation. Then Taejin said that he didn't kill Park and didn't understand what Sang Yui was talking about. The recording was turned off. Sang Yui then gave Taejin a flash disk so he could see the contents for himself. When Sang Yui got into the car, Detective Jung and Yoonjin also got into the car. Detective Jung and Yoonjin immediately accused Sang Yui of being the doctor who made the yellow pill. Sang Yui doesn't know what they are talking about, but Detective Jung knows that Sang Yui and Lee often meet in the frozen warehouse after hours. Initially, Lee made the yellow pill, but now Sang Yui continues. Yoonjin also wanted to confirm whether Park was selling illegal drugs to collect 500 million, but the money couldn't be taken because Taejin wanted to give only half the passcode. Sang Yui didn't answer and then took Detective Jung and Yoonjin to the frozen warehouse. In one of the cold rooms, there is another secret room where yellow pills have been produced all this time. Detective Jung needs clarification about why Sang Yui brought them there. Sang Yui admitted that he was the one who made Detective Jung addicted to the drug out of hatred. Detective Jung is clearly furious. Yoonjin tried to break them up. At the same time, Won meets his father, who is happy because the mayor now approves his project. The father is now starting to consider Won as his son. It's not in vain that Won has been imitating Taejin all this time, but now Won can be himself. Won can easily replace his friends because he now has the highest position. The father then asked Won to undergo treatment because Won should not be dependent on drugs forever. Won complied. Meanwhile, Taejin is now confused because he was promoted to Chief Prosecutor of Criminal Division 2 and was transferred to the Prosecutor's Office of the Department of Justice. Taejin clearly didn't accept it. Returning to Detective Jung, Sang Yui admits that he does not have an antidote for his drug addiction. Here, Sang Yui admits that he was also the one who had been sending packages to Detective Jung on behalf of Park and sent messages with the code 1882. When he was at school, Park once told him that code when another student beat Sang Yui. Detective Jung is confused about what he did until Sang Yui makes him what he is now. Sang Yui reasoned that in the third year of high school, Park started playing with Detective Jung, Yoonjin, and Jusong, even though Sang Yui used to be Park's only true friend. Since then, Park no longer cares about him. Sang Yui hates that Park has been taken from him. When Chuntae died and Detective Jung changed schools, Park and Yoonjin broke up and the audiophile room was destroyed. Until 20 years later, Sang Yui and Park were fine, but the triumvirate took advantage of Park and went too far. Initially, Park was only told to deliver medicine, then Taejin ordered him to sell medicine, and when Park wanted to stop, Taejin forbade him. Sang Yui also saw that Taejin was having an affair with Mrs. Park. Detective Jung is increasingly annoyed because he feels he has nothing to do with it all. But Sang Yui said that Detective Jung was the worst because Park had come to see Detective Jung dozens of times, but Detective Jung still refused his apology. If Park dies, only Detective Jung and Yoonjin can uncover what happened. That's why Park made Detective Jung and Yoonjin the insurance hares. Sang Yui was just confused even though for the last 20 years he had always been by Park's side, but Park instead wrote down the names of Detective Jung and Yoonjin. Park once said he really liked Detective Jung because Detective Jung was special. For this reason, Sang Yui arranges a plan so that Detective Jung can arrest Jusong, Boss Yun, Sang Yui himself, and then Taejin. But unfortunately, Detective Jung wasn't good enough to fight Jusong at that time. He even lost his gun. All of this is a scenario that Sang Yui designed. Sang Yui even moved Lee's body to the house with No Gumin that night. No Gumin is the driver who takes Park to the construction site. Detective Jung and Yoonjin can ask No Gumin himself what this has to do with the ongoing case when they meet later. No Gumin's address is at the grandmother who received pension insurance from Park. Then Sang Yui revealed that the reason he moved Lee's body was that Jung was taken as bait, so that Jung would be trapped along with Chai Hyun and Won. Unfortunately, Detective Jung didn't move as quickly as Sang Yui had planned. There are many things that Detective Jung missed. Detective Jung is very angry because all this time his life was controlled, then made him addicted just because Sang Yui hated him so much. Sang Yui is also as sinful as the others. Sang Yui didn't do anything when Taejin and Won tricked Park. Sang Yui said that this revenge was his doing. Sang Yui then begs Detective Jung to arrest Taejin because Sang Yui has evidence that Taejin killed Park and was selling illegal drugs from the start. Taejin stopped the elevator when Park fell, not letting the others look at the floor. Taejin was also the one who examined the body and prohibited an autopsy. Still, they didn't have physical evidence because Taejin had cut ties with Park and never said anything about illegal drugs over the phone. His connection with Jinuk was also handed over to Park. If the case is investigated further, it will be revealed that Sang Yui is the drug maker and Park is the one selling the drug. Even though Park is dead, Sang Yui can make Taejin make a mistake to prove that Taejin was the perpetrator who killed Park. Sang Yui won't run away either. He promises to pay for all his sins and is willing to be arrested as long as Detective Jung catches Taejin. That's why Sang Yui dared to take Detective Jung and Yoonjin to the drug production site. Sang Yui wants his revenge to be avenged. Sang Yui apologizes and wants to be given time to catch Taejin first. Meanwhile, Won's father wants to go home and Taejin arrives, so they talk together. Taejin admits that he never wanted to be a prosecutor, but Chairman Won always sued him. Taejin doesn't work because he wants to because Taejin's real dream is to become a businessman. Taejin has also served Chairman Won for a long time and knows Won well, so Taejin knows more than anyone else about the company. That's why Taejin wants to be involved in investing in the project. Taejin asks for his mutation to be withdrawn, but Chairman Won refuses because he knows that Taejin sells illegal drugs. The biggest risk to the business they face now is not Won but Taejin. Initially, Chairman Won thought that Taejin was in the illegal drug business for a while, but instead, it has continued until now. Chairman Won doesn't like it when project funds are mixed with money from illegal drug sales. Taejin also admitted to selling illegal drugs with Park because that was the fastest way to get money. Chairman Won is also equally guilty because he used to buy other people's companies at cheap prices. Many people end their lives because they feel cheated. The money that Chairman Won makes is also no cleaner than Taejin's drug sales. Chairman Won also brought up that Taejin was just a poor child that he took care of and raised until now. He never tried to make Taejin a person who could make a lot of money. Then Chairman Won left. Meanwhile, Detective Jung is now leaving again with Yoonjin, who is confused about why Detective Jung just let Sang Yui go. But Sang Yui's words are true if they haven't found evidence of Taejin's involvement. Meanwhile, Won books a hotel and hosts a big party before treatment. Chai Hyun contacted Sang Yui to bring medicine to the hotel, but then Chai Hyun got a message from the person assigned to spy on Taejin. There's a photo of Sang Yui with Detective Jung and Yoonjin. Elsewhere, the police finally found Jung's body in the forest. Continue to episode 13. Chai Hyun comes to the hotel to meet Won with bad news. Meanwhile, the police have now found Jung's body, but the person who made the report does not want to reveal his identity. There is a strong suspicion that the reporter saw the perpetrator who killed or buried Jung. Then the police found Jung's shoes with blood stains, and because the forest area was not a hiking trail, there must be a reason why the witness saw Jung's body in that place. On a nearby tree, there is a tool used to extract tree sap. Another time, Taejin, who was exercising while remembering what Chairman Won had said, was suddenly contacted by Won and forced to come to the meeting place. Taejin, who actually wanted to refuse, was forced to obey. Back to Detective Jung and his boss thinking about how to catch Jinuk at the port tomorrow while also proving their doubts to the junior. Taejin also finally arrived at the meeting place. There was already a helpless Sang Yui, battered and beaten by them. Chai Hyun and Won immediately beat Taejin. Won didn't think that Taejin had been in the drug business all this time without his knowledge. The yellow pill that has been circulating is the same drug he has been taking all this time. Taejin must have thought of a way to escape and trap Won when the drug factory was dismantled. The one they should have killed was not Jung but Taejin. Taejin even mocks Won, who is nothing if not born into a rich family. Even Won won't be able to survive because he's too stupid. Taejin also instigates Chai Hyun, who has extraordinary talent but ends up being under Won's feet. Chai Hyun and Won beat Taejin even more after hearing what the man said. Won wants to know what Taejin is doing with all the money from his drug sales. Taejin also told him the first 4 digits of the passcode from his crypto wallet, but Taejin didn't know the next 4 codes because Park betrayed him. That money no one can take unless Park lives again. Sang Yui also confirmed what Taejin said. Won couldn't understand Taejin's stupidity in sharing the passcode with Park. Won tells Chai Hyun to take a yellow pill to give to Taejin so Taejin can taste how the medicine he sells tastes. They must have proof that Taejin consumed illegal drugs. That way, Taejin won't be able to do anything stupid again. After Chai Hyun left, Won admitted that the reason he was friends with Taejin was because of his father. Then he said that people like Taejin wouldn't be able to survive without having a smart brain. Won is fed up with his father demanding that he be someone like Taejin, but Taejin wants to be Won instead. Suddenly, from behind, Sang Yui attacks until Won is unconscious. Sang Yui and Taejin then left that place. Chai Hyun, who had just arrived, was very confused and panicked when he saw Won's condition and realized that he could no longer catch Taejin and Sang Yui. Taejin will eliminate all evidence of his involvement and make Sang Yui a scapegoat. If Sang Yui wants to survive, then he must obey. Then Taejin took Sang Yui's cell phone and immediately destroyed it. After that, Taejin ordered Sang Yui to go abroad within the next 12 hours. The next day, Detective Jung, Yoonjun, and Jusung go out together. Here, Jusung is annoyed because he just found out that Detective Jung is a drug user and didn't tell him from the start. Yoonjun tried to defend herself because she also accidentally found out. Now they come to the address receiving Park's pension insurance. They met a man named No Juman. The man Detective Jung has been looking for because he is the taxi driver who took Park to the construction site, and the woman with No Guman is Kyung-tae's mother. They continued chatting. During his life, Park often visited Kyung-tae's mother. No Juman admitted that he was Kyung-tae's friend who witnessed the incident 20 years ago. Then 10 years passed, Park started coming to see Kyung-tae's mother and crying hysterically. Park apologizes because he could have prevented Kyung-tae's death. Now the woman prepared food for them. They continued chatting with No Juman. This man admitted that day he didn't talk to Park about anything important while in the car, but Park gave him a flash disk to give to Detective Jung and Yoonjun when they arrived. They checked the contents of the flash disk and showed CCTV footage at a shop near the construction area. There was Jung who brought Lee Myung-guk. This means that Park knew all along that Lee was killed by Jung and Chai Hyun. Sang Yui also seemed to have known and moved Lee's body with No Juman that night. Sang Yui heard what Park said over the phone to Chai Hyun. So after Park's death, No Juman received news from Sang Yui that Park had died at the construction site. He and Sang Yui then saw Jung and Chai Hyun leaving for the frozen warehouse. They followed him and realized that Chai Hyun was carrying Lee's body. Elsewhere, Taejin is now searching the frozen room belonging to Won's pharmaceutical company. Then Chai Hyun brings bad news to Won that Taejin confiscated the frozen warehouse because of the discovery of a drug manufacturing factory. Jung's body has also been found. Won is increasingly panicking. He has to meet his father. Chairman Won also doesn't understand what Taejin is doing. They must prevent negative news from spreading. Won, who came, was immediately questioned by his father. He was sure there must be a problem between Taejin and Won. Won admitted that Taejin had been making and distributing illegal drugs all this time. Won didn't know that his father already knew that Taejin was selling drugs. The problem was that last night, Won wanted to punish Taejin by taking his own medicine. The father became increasingly angry with Won. Returning to Detective Jung, No Juman said that in 2005 he witnessed how Won and his group beat Kyung-tae. Then the fire spread quickly and burned the place. Chai Hyun realized that Kyung-tae was helpless. They panicked, and because the fire was getting bigger, Taejin asked them to leave immediately. But then Won came again, and Kyung-tae, who regained consciousness, asked for help, but instead, Won panicked and beat him brutally until Kyung-tae died. No Juman saw the murder committed by Won. After Won left, No Juman approached and was hysterical about his friend's death, leaving Won Jong-soo's name tag in that place. No Juman had given the name tag to Park. No Juman is also confused about why 20 years ago Detective Jung didn't question him even though No Juman was a witness. If Detective Jung's report is true, Detective Jung doesn't have to change schools. Their conversation stopped when Kyung-tae's mother brought food. After eating, they took their leave. They suspected that Park must have been devastated after hearing about the incident 20 years ago from No Juman. They then reminisced about when they visited Park's grandfather's house in the summer of 2005. They came to the beach and wanted to camp. That night, Detective Jung and Park talked together. Detective Jung needs clarification as to why Park rushed home to his grandfather's house after the school holidays without telling them beforehand. Detective Jung also felt that Park was becoming more closed off and didn't want to tell him anything anymore. Detective Jung wants to know what Park actually saw the day Kyung-tae died. That was the first time Detective Jung learned what actually happened. Detective Jung is very angry because what Won and his group did cannot be tolerated. At that time, Detective Jung invited Park to report to the police, but Park refused. Yoonjun also admitted that actually when Detective Jung and Park were talking together, she was in the tent and heard everything. Yoonjun apologizes to Detective Jung because even after hearing everything, she doesn't defend him at all. So Detective Jung has to change schools. Meanwhile, at the police station, the police inspector now secretly breaks into Detective Jung's locker and takes a strand of hair from his clothes. Detective Jung has now finally arrived at the port and is preparing his plan with his boss. The boss was also still thinking about Kim Chang-soo and imagining how it was impossible for the accident that night to happen. Kim Chang-soo was speeding even though the passenger behind him tried to kick him. There was a strong belief at that time that their junior had deliberately killed Boss Yun's subordinate because he wanted to cover up something. Meanwhile, Yoonjin and Jusong were traveling by bus. They thought about Park, who seemed to know that his life was in danger, so he took out insurance and then entrusted the flash disk to No Juman. Jusong also initially hated Park. After Park died, Detective Jung ended up using illegal drugs and Yoonjin was kidnapped and even almost killed by Tajin. But after meeting No Juman, Jusong was convinced that Park was actually lonely. Even though Park seems to have many friends, it turns out that Park's real friends are only the three of them. Then Yoonjin received information about a frozen warehouse that Tajin had confiscated and a drug factory was discovered. The pharmaceutical company came to their editorial office and seemed to want to prevent the circulation of negative news. At the same time, Tajin now comes to Won and his father. Tajin understands Chairman Won's condition, who has children, but they are useless. Tajin wants Won handed over to him. Otherwise, the company's name will be further tarnished. Chairman Won clearly refused, but then the mayor contacted him. Chairman Won looked panicked when he picked up the phone, but Tajin took over the call. It turned out that the mayor was annoyed and wanted to confirm whether it was true that Won was producing, consuming, and selling illegal drugs. Then Tajin made an offer to Won's chairman. If Won were handed over, then his father's business would continue to run. The mayor needs clarification as to why Tajin is making an offer to Chairman Won. Unexpectedly, Chairman Won wants to keep his company. Then he promised to free Won as soon as possible. Won really didn't expect his father's decision. He panicked and begged his father while crying. Tajin then sent the mayor a photo and asked the mayor to forget the conversation that had just taken place. Tajin threatened to distribute photos of the mayor, who likes snacking on women if he doesn't do what he says. The mayor complied. Tajin then leaves and another officer also takes Won. On the other hand, Detective Jung and his superiors prepare equipment to arrest Jinuk. Kim Chang-soo will be assigned as the person who will accompany Jinuk to the ship later. Detective Jung prepares a bulletproof vest for Kim Chang-soo. Not long after, Detective Jung received information from the female junior that the car carrying Boss Yun and Kim Chang-soo's men in the accident actually had a black box and half of the files in the black box had been recovered. Detective Jung, who saw the film, couldn't say anything anymore. His suspicions were correct all along. That night, Detective Jung took Kim Chang-soo's gun and said that his junior had been arrested for killing Boss Yun's men on purpose. Kim Chang-soo wants to defend himself, but Detective Jung shows him the video before the accident. Boss Yun's men never attacked anything, but Kim Chang-soo deliberately opened the window and plunged into the waters. Kim Chang-soo couldn't dodge it any longer. He fell silent and complied to be detained. Another policeman then took him away. Now, since Kim Chang-soo couldn't continue with the plan, his superior would take his place. He'll meet Jinuk. Then the boss lent his gun to Detective Jung just in case because he wouldn't be able to carry the gun when he was with Jinuk. The plan began to be executed. They moved together because if too many parties were involved, the risk of the plan being discovered was very high. Detective Jung watched from afar and then saw Jinuk coming, so he tried to get closer. Jinuk meets with superiors from the police. Here, Jinuk didn't suspect anything at all. Not long after, a car approached carrying the person who would accompany them. However, Detective Jung received information from the former convicts that their plan had been discovered and they would be moving to another dock. A second later, Detective Jung's superior was stabbed by the mysterious man, but luckily, because of the vest and thick clothes he was wearing, he didn't get hurt. Detective Jung gets closer as Jinuk and another person leave by car. Detective Jung, who didn't want his plan to fail, immediately gave chase in his car too and got information about the nearest pier, which was most likely Jinuk's destination for carrying out transactions. Finally, Detective Jung arrived at the pier, but Detective Jung immediately hit another car. However, Jinuk was no longer there. He had gone sailing on a ship. Detective Jung, not wanting to be outdone, went straight to the nearest cliff and saw Jinuk's presence on the ship. Having difficulty shooting, Detective Jung used a rope on the fence and started shooting, hitting the man with a wound on his face. Not long after that, other police begin to arrive but want to arrest Detective Jung for violating drug abuse laws. Continuing to episode 14, Detective Jung's superior was annoyed with Detective Jung's arrest and asked him to talk outside. There was resistance, but his more senior superiors acted as they pleased and believed that taking Detective Jung's hair without consent was illegal. Detective Jung's boss takes Detective Jung away and releases him. Detective Jung had refused, but then he admitted that he had been addicted since the day after they had dinner together. At that time, he was kidnapped and force-fed, so he didn't remember anything that happened that day. Even though the incident was someone else's doing after that, Detective Jung consumed the drug. Detective Jung's boss makes excuses, while Kim Chang-soo also admits that he was involved with Boss Yun, because he received a bribe. Their superiors won't let Detective Jung be detained because they don't want to lose any more members. Elsewhere, Yunjin gets a package in Park's name in the form of a flash disk containing photos of the mayor's naughty life. Yunjin went to see Sang Yui because she was sure that the sender was Sang Yui, but Sang Yui didn't want to explain where she got the photos. Sang Yui asked Yunjin to keep writing the article because it was Park's request for revenge. Yunjin then said that it seemed like Sang Yui wasn't Park's friend because Sang Yui couldn't differentiate between friendship and obsession. Yunjin knows that Park is not the person who will take revenge. All of this is just Sang Yui's game. Since the beginning, Sang Yui has only been a side character but wants to be the center of everything. If the article continues to be published, it doesn't mean it's because of Sang Yui, but because Yunjin is just fed up with people who have power. Then Yunjin went to the office and met her boss to publish news about the mayor based on the photos she had. But the boss was very panicked and afraid to know these facts. So Yunjin said that if his boss didn't want to publish an article about the mayor, then Yunjin would quit his job. Back with Detective Jung and his boss, they run into Kim Chang-soo. Detective Jung asks why Kim Chang-soo did all this. Kim Chang-soo admitted that every time they arrested drug addicts, in the end, they would be released again and would not change. Kim Chang-soo is tired of continuing to catch the same criminals, so by inviting Boss Yun to work together, this young man is sure he can prevent the spread of drugs and only control people who have consumed them. Detective Jung couldn't understand what his junior was saying. Then Detective Jung explained that it was their job to catch criminals, and even though in the end the criminals came back, they still had to catch them regularly. If not caught immediately, criminals will become more numerous and difficult to deal with. Even though it's boring, that's their job as police. Detective Jung just didn't expect Kim Chang-soo to give up information in exchange for money, betray his colleagues, and kill. Detective Jung is very embarrassed to have worked with Kim Chang-soo. This made Kim Chang-soo angry and said that Detective Jung should have asked him for help, but Detective Jung didn't care. Another time, Taejin met with Chairman Won and promised that Won would not be subject to a long sentence. Taejin will only arrest Won and will not arrest the company representative, even though he is also addicted. For drug distribution, Taejin will scapegoat Sang Yui as a researcher, manufacturer, and drug deliverer. Chairman Won asks what Taejin wants now. Taejin also said without further ado that he wanted to take over all ongoing projects and asked for 6% of the company's shares. Taejin will also immediately stop being a prosecutor after solving Won's problems. Chairman Won agreed with the man's request. Back at the office, Detective Jung, Kim Chang-soo, and the superior are questioned further by the branch and criminal division heads. The boss is still trying to defend himself because taking Detective Jung's hair is illegal, but the police inspector has a witness from the dealer who gives his statement. The superior remains adamant that Detective Jung took the drug accidentally during the investigation process. Detective Jung should have been rewarded, not punished. Kim Chang-soo then spoke up and admitted that he knew that Detective Jung consumed illegal drugs because he was the one who made him addicted. Everyone didn't expect it, and Detective Jung was also annoyed that his junior didn't tell the truth. But Kim Chang-soo has recording evidence when Detective Jung was dizzy and almost unconscious after leaving Lee Min-guk's house. It turns out that when Detective Jung was unconscious, he did not have time to consume the yellow pill. But Kim Chang-soo approached him and looked panicked, seeing that Detective Jung's condition was not fine. So Kim Chang-soo gave the yellow pill to Detective Jung. Next, Kim Chang-soo started lying, saying that Detective Jung was deliberately addicted because he suspected him and Boss Yun. Detective Jung asked Kim Chang-soo to speak the truth and not to make up lies like that to protect him. But Kim Chang-soo still wants to take the blame, upsetting Detective Jung. The commotion was broken up and the inspector was annoyed because Detective Jung shouldn't have been punished. Elsewhere, Yunjin's boss couldn't believe what he had just seen, and after thinking carefully, he agreed to publish an article about the mayor. Back at the police station, Detective Jung was declared innocent because he accidentally became addicted while on duty. Even though he was immediately told to rest, Detective Jung will still work for the next 3 days. They also got a sketch of the face of the person who killed Jung, namely Chae-hyun. Meanwhile, when Taejin meets Won, he looks annoyed, but Taejin seems relaxed and promises to help free Won as soon as possible. It's just that Taejin wants Won to obey him after he gets out, or else Taejin will reveal the other crimes that Won committed to the public. Taejin wants Won to take over his father's entire business so that only the two of them will be at the peak of glory. After that, Taejin met Chae-hyun and stated that he would make Chae-hyun his best friend. Taejin said that he had forgiven their previous conflict. Next month, Taejin will no longer be a prosecutor, and now he will only look for Sang Yui as the main perpetrator of their case. Sang Yui contacted Taejin. This man was very upset because Sang Yui had yet to go abroad. Taejin then asks Sang Yui to surrender, but Sang Yui threatens to spread evidence of Taejin's involvement as the mastermind behind the yellow pill business with Park. There is other evidence that he has apart from his cell phone. Taejin wasn't even afraid of being threatened, but Sang Yui also felt that Taejin would be able to escape again. So for that reason, Sang Yui invited them to meet so they could solve their problems. Meanwhile, Yoonjin now meets her boss Park, who works at a property company. The boss actually wanted to meet Mrs. Park, but the woman was in the hospital and received information that Yoonjin was Park's friend. So the woman came to give Park's inheritance. Then Yoonjin contacted Detective Jung, telling him that the location of Park's death was Kumtae's house 20 years ago. Now Chae-hyun comes to Jung's death ceremony. Jung's wife asked Chae-hyun to convey it to Taejin and Won to give her monthly money because she knew that Jung's murder was the plan of the three of them. Jung's wife also knows the secret of another crime. He must continue to live with his daughter. Chae-hyun agreed to the woman's request. However, when he was about to leave, Chae-hyun was arrested by the police because he was declared to have killed Jung. Jung's wife really didn't expect it and became even more hysterical when she found out about this fact. Detective Jung and Yoonjin then meet and discuss the location of Park's death, which apparently was Kumtae's house 20 years ago. Since the fire and Kumtae's death, land and buildings in the area have been sold at low prices. The buyer is Taejin's company. Detective Jung then gets a call from Sang Yui. Meanwhile, Detective Jung's boss meets Junik, who is still safe. This woman wants to know who's organizing the smuggling and the mastermind behind the spread of the yellow pills. Junik mentioned the doctor he knew was named Taejin. Detective Jung's gun has also been sent to the doctor. Elsewhere, Sang Yui met Taejin, who immediately confiscated Taejin's cell phone and even brought an anti-eavesdropping device so that Sang Yui couldn't do anything wrong. Taejin immediately asked for proof of his involvement, but Sang Yui admitted that he didn't have that proof. Taejin immediately became angry and beat Sang Yui, until Sang Yui was afraid and couldn't fight back. However, Detective Jung comes to stop Taejin's behavior. Detective Jung's unhealthy attitude makes Taejin believe that Detective Jung is addicted, just like the police inspector said. Detective Jung wanted to ask something, but before that, Taejin asked for his cell phone so that Detective Jung couldn't eavesdrop on their conversation. Taejin started asking Detective Jung to ask questions quickly because he had contacted investigators to arrest Detective Jung and Sang Yui. Detective Jung wants the truth about Park selling illegal drugs so he can treat his son to America. Initially, Park received monthly assistance from Won $5 million to pay for his son's medical expenses, but Won was not willing to give and stopped giving. After that, Taejin came to meet Park and asked him to do business within 3 months so that Park could raise money for his son's treatment. Park immediately refused, but then the hospital provided information about treatment in America at a price of $500 million. So Park goes to Won and asks for a loan. Park promises to do anything, but Won feels that Park has been lied to by the hospital and wants to avoid lending him the money. Won will instead give $5 million as before. After that, Park met Taejin and agreed to sell the yellow pills until he earned $500 million. Meanwhile, Won's leaders panic when they see negative news about their mayor, especially since it is starting to be linked to Won's case. Chairman Won tries to contact Taejin, but Taejin doesn't notice because his cell phone is in the safe. Detective Jung then reveals that the reason Park invited the triumvirate to the construction site was because it used to be Kumtae's house. Park plans to reveal all the secret information about the three of them, namely Taejin, who was distributing illegal drugs without Won's knowledge, Chae-hyun and Jung, who killed Lee Myung-guk, and Won, who killed Kumtae. But before he could reveal the secret, Park was killed by someone. The culprit was definitely among the people who came, and Taejin didn't look at the floor where Park was at all. Taejin immediately stopped the elevator and returned to the first floor. Taejin also checked on Park's death, asked everyone to leave the place, and even obstructed the autopsy. The proof that Park was murdered was that he was wearing shoes when he fell. The next day, the shoes were found upstairs. Taejin also admitted that he was the one who killed Park, but that wasn't his plan at first. Taejin, all this time, just wanted to collect money so he could be involved in investing in Won's project. But Park didn't want to give out the 4-digit crypto wallet passcode and would instead reveal their secret. There was another person who helped Taejin apply anesthesia to keep Park quiet and pushed him from the 9th floor. But as for the shoe plan, it wasn't Taejin's idea. Taejin also admitted that he didn't know who that person was. At least now, Taejin is relieved because he can convey what he has been holding back all this time. Then Taejin offers Detective Jung a job so they can be great together. Taejin isn't suited to working with Park, who has no ambition, and instead arranges for him to share the passcode. Park also needs help looking after his wife. When she hears Taejin keep taunting Park, Sang Yui loses his temper and immediately shoots him with Detective Jung's gun. 1 month later, Detective Jung comes to Sang Yui prison. Detective Jung has received treatment and his condition is getting better. Sang Yui has heard that Detective Jung's rank was demoted because Sang Yui took his gun to shoot Taejin. Sang Yui also didn't regret shooting Taejin at all because he had avenged Park against that man. Sang Yui has maintained a friendship with Park. This has calmed his heart. Detective Jung brings up that 20 years ago, Won and his gang seemed normal. They defend each other, even Park, who Detective Jung considers a friend, doesn't take his side. Since then, Detective Jung no longer believes in friendship. He doesn't want to be friends anymore, but if he were in Park's position, Detective Jung would also do the same thing as Park. Detective Jung also discusses Park's revenge, but it looks like Park will never want it. Now Detective Jung wants to look after his friends who are with him. Detective Jung also asks Sang Yui and asks him to improve himself, become better, and become the person Park hopes for because Park is Sang Yui's only friend. Then Sang Yui asked Detective Jung not to come to him again because he didn't want to feel guilty for making up revenge in Park's name. Before parting ways, Sang Yui mentioned Taejin's 4-digit passcode, namely Mrs. Park's birthday. After that, Detective Jung wanted to meet Kim Chang-soo, but his supervisor said that Kim Chang-soo refused to meet Detective Jung. So Detective Jung said that he would not let Kim Chang-soo be punished for an act he did not commit. Later, Detective Jung, Yoonjin, Jusong, and Mrs. Park visit Park's grave. After Mrs. Park said goodbye, Yoonjin discussed insurance and Park's will. Detective Jung then received news that Park's autopsy report had come out and the perpetrator who killed him had been arrested. Detective Jung comes to the police station and sees the murderer being interrogated. He is Chairman Won's secretary. On Park's nails, DNA belonging to the man was found. Previously, the man also had a criminal record, so his DNA results were easier for the police to track. In fact, the man immediately admitted his actions without further ado, as if he had prepared everything. In his notebook, there was an order to kill Park according to Taejin's plan. Detective Jung feels something is strange when he comes to see Chairman Won. Detective Jung feels Taejin and Chairman Won worked together to kill Park, because Chairman Won didn't want to answer. Detective Jung turned off his phone and digital watch. Then Detective Jung revealed that there was a note from the secretary's book that the night before his death, Park visited Won's father. Detective Jung wants to know what conversation happened at that time. Chairman Won remembered that Park had met him and asked him to talk. Park talked about Won making illegal drugs in a frozen warehouse and he was the courier, but Taejin sold the drugs to outsiders. Park also knows that Chairman Won burned down the area around Kyung-tae's house, which at that time was against construction. At the same time, Kyung-tae died not because of a fire but because Won killed him. Park gave Won Jong-soo's name tag, which still had traces of blood on it. But for Chairman Won, now the name tag cannot be used as proof of anything. Then Park asked for money to help with his son's treatment. Otherwise, Park would reveal Chairman Won's crime 20 years ago to get people's land at a cheap price. From the secretary's notes, Detective Jung also saw the schedule Taejin was invited to come after Park left. When he heard this question, Chairman Won admitted that he wanted to confirm the truth of the illegal drugs that Taejin was selling based on Park's words. Instead of getting angry, Chairman Won explained Park's plan, which was to invite the three of them to make them confess all their crimes or Park would reveal them. Then Taejin apologizes and promises to kill Park and make it look like he ended his own life. Taejin explains the plan in detail, but Chairman Won forgets and doesn't hear the plan clearly. Chairman Won also opposed this action. But Detective Jung feels there is something strange about Chairman Won's confession. Detective Jung began to reveal his observations that Taejin was not brought in to be scolded for selling illegal drugs. Taejin admits guilt and makes a plan to kill Park. Taejin asked Chairman Won to contact Park and asked to meet first before Park met them all. So half an hour before death, Park came to the construction site and went to the 9th floor. He thought there was Chairman Won. Apparently, it was the secretary who immediately attacked Park. After Park faints, the triumvirate and Sang Yui arrive. The secretary turned on the lights on the 9th floor according to the previous plan. But when he wanted to bring Park down, Park woke up and rebelled. He stumbled and attacked the secretary so that the man's DNA was found during an autopsy. After making Park unconscious again, the secretary started to knock him down before Taejin and the others reached the 9th floor. But that wasn't Taejin's plan because the secretary couldn't possibly obey Taejin. Detective Jung believes Park's murder was Chairman Won's plan because Chairman Won has committed many crimes. But Chairman Won still tries to deny all that and drives Detective Jung away. Chairman Won confirmed that Taejin was the perpetrator because, from the start, he wanted to make it look like Park had ended his own life. Even his shoes were taken off on the 9th floor. However, Taejin previously said that taking his shoes off was not his plan. Detective Jung started to search for the older man even more. Detective Jung believes Chairman 1 doesn't know that Taejin understands that people who end their lives don't care if they wear shoes or not. But Chairman 1 wants to make it seem like Park really wants to end his life, so he asks the secretary to take Park's shoes. But the secretary seemed to have forgotten and didn't have time to take off Park's shoes, so Park fell with his shoes on. From the start, Taejin didn't mind wearing shoes or not, but Chairman 1 insisted that those who end their lives must take off their shoes. Then this older man explained that he killed Park because he had been preparing for one's success for 20 years and didn't want Park to destroy it. The court father finally admitted that he was the one who ordered his secretary to kill Park because Park was ungrateful and wanted to destroy his 20-year dream for one. Then Chairman 1 drives Detective Jung away. Unfortunately, Detective Jung can't get that big confession, so Chairman 1 won't be able to be arrested. However, unbeknownst to Chairman 1, Detective Jung has a recording device that has been on. So far, anyone who meets Chairman 1 has to be checked by his secretary, but now the man is at the police station, so Detective Jung passes the check and manages to smuggle the recorder. Now Chairman 1 can no longer move. 2 weeks after that, Detective Jung had gone 50 days without the yellow pill. Detective Jung's condition continues to improve, and after seeing the news of the arrest of Chairman 1, who was involved in Park's death, their company was also declared bankrupt. Detective Jung then throws away his spare yellow pills. After that, he got a message from Jusong. Then Yoonjin immediately informed Detective Jung. Then they came to the place where the young man knew Park. Detective Jung spoke alone with the young man. Detective Jung gives life advice. He's happy because the young man has many friends. Detective Jung also asked to be contacted if the young man needed anything. Not long after that, Yoonjin and Jusong arrived. After they spent time at that place, they went home together. Yoonjin looked unhappy, even though she had just received a very large amount of insurance money. Yoonjin was confused because she felt it was not her right. Yoonjin asked what Detective Jung would do with the insurance money. Detective Jung thought about helping Jung's wife, and Yoonjin invited her to give the money to Park's wife too. After that, they helped Mrs. Park move. At least now they have forgiven each other. Yoonjin also admitted that she had received the insurance money, but Mrs. Park isn't even angry anymore, making Yoonjin confused. Mrs. Park doesn't want to worry about the insurance money anymore, but Yoonjin admits that she has already sent the money. Detective Jung also sent the money to Mrs. Park. Actually, the woman was reluctant to accept the money, but she was very grateful and called Yoonjin her sister. Jusong then found an old video of them on holiday together. They also watched the moment 20 years ago. In the video, Yoonjin, who dreams of becoming a reporter, already has a talent for recording, while Park dreams of always playing with the audiophile club. Now they're coming to the beach again, thanks to Park. They came to that place together. They believe that before Park died, he actually wanted to re-establish lost friendships. Even though Park is no longer there, they have succeeded in uniting their friendship again, and the relationship between friends is because there is an element of reciprocity and insincerity. Maybe the term is no longer a friend but a connection. Jusong also still remembers the date they came to the beach 20 years ago, because it coincided with his mother's birthday. But apart from him, Park also remembers that several years ago, Jusong met Park, who suddenly discussed his mother's birthday. Park even said that that date was their friendship day. Detective Jung and Yoonjin felt like they had realized something. They then accessed the crypto website as Taejin showed them first. Detective Jung still remembers the 4-digit initial code according to Sang Yu's words, and when combined with the date of Friendship Day, they are very happy. They can't believe it because they managed to open the digital wallet. The story ended.